Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast, where I think this might be number 32, number 33, perhaps more accurately. I'm back with Joe Blevins and Jim Pontolillo, and we were here last time around talking about Tony Blacktagris, and today we're going to review another fairly obscure Ed tome, To Make a Homo from 1971, Little Library Presses To Make a Homo from 1971. We'll talk more about the origins of Little Library Press, and we're going to obviously talk fairly extensively, I have a feeling, about this book. We're also joined by W. Paul Apel. Paul, I'm glad you joined us as well. Paul has been here at the podcast as well. We talked about Frank Leahy. Paul and I debated a short story called The Golden Rivet and came to somewhat different conclusions a little while back. So I'm happy to have Paul here again. And I've assembled you guys to tell me a little bit more about the To Make a Homo. So I want you guys to throw it around the room, introduce yourselves, please. But Joe, I think, has prepared a little bit of a summary for us. So let's start with you, Joe.
I have. First off, glad to be here to talking about this incredible novel. That is one of the it's one of the more obscure novels, even though it has Ed's name right on the cover. Because in my preparation for this, I looked around for coverage of this book in other Ed Wood related books, and there's not that much. Nightmare of Ecstasy mentions it, but Muddled Mind I don't think covers it, and Ed Wood Slee's Paperbacks I don't think covers it. So happy to be here to talk about this book. And here's my summary, and I'll get your guys' opinion about this. I see this as the classic Horatio Alger story in reverse. Normally it's about a nice boy from a good home who, through sheer pluck and grit and determination, makes his way up to the status of heroin-addicted gay prostitute. I think this is his ladder of success, as we see through the book, as he's getting more and more into this world. And by the way, it all starts at a church picnic. And I realize now in my adult years that I shouldn't have missed my church picnics, because I didn't know what goes on at these things. I thought it would have been boring, but it is anything but boring. So very excited to talk about this book.
Superb, right? Superb. Thanks, Joe. How about Jim? We want to give us a few opening words.
Hi, Jim Pontolillo. Glad to be back again amongst the few people on the planet that have probably read this book in the last 50 to 60 years. Yeah, and I think Joe gave a good opening summary, and I'll just pass it along to Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul. Greg kind of introed me earlier, but yeah, I took a look at this book as well, and the main character is named Paul. So there you go. So it was a good book for me to cover, from cover to cover. And one interesting thing I thought, and maybe we'll get into this later, is I felt there was a better book in this book that didn't end up paying off. Instead going the route Joe mentioned, which is the spiraling into addiction and prostitution. But there's a brief glimmer of a somewhat interesting potential plot, and then Ed veers away from it or forgets about it. But anyway, maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later.
Sure. No, that's intriguing. Thanks, Paul. I'm curious. Let's jump right to it. So, real quick though. So the main character, Paul Call, is in the first scene of the film. He's at the church picnic, and he's forced. I'm not sure how much he's forced to give a blowjob to one of the toughs in town, Tommy Grimes, who it turns out is actually the pusher. He's the heroin pusher in town. It turns out a little bit later, but Paul performs the act and is left hanging. Tommy has committed to him that he will return it in kind, and then after Paul finishes him off, Tommy's like, "Fuck off." I'm paraphrasing, and then suddenly Mary Kolaski appears in the woods. Mary Kolaski, by the way, and
one point not to skip over quick, Greg, is
they're all high schoolers, by the way, which is a sensitive point. Go ahead, Jim.
One point not to skip over is, of course, Tommy laughs when he's asked to reciprocate, and he does that classic thing of saying, "I'm not a queer."
Right.
So it's like you
Exactly.
can be straight and have a guy perform on you, but if you perform on another guy, then now that's somehow different. Anyway,
Yep.
so there's that sort of
Yep.
little,
Right.
okay.
Well, that I think is important in the whole through line of the book. Exactly what are we talking about here in terms of defining what is or what is not homosexuality? So it becomes more nebulous, perhaps, as the book wears
Yeah.
on. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I wondered who was the potential audience for this
Right.
book, because uh, I would assume it is gay men who want graphic depictions of gay sex, which there are throughout this book. But there's also uh, a lot of heterosexual activity throughout this book as well. And the gay characters are depicted pretty negatively. So I don't know who Ed was trying to appeal to in this book other than himself. And I think a lot of times Ed will steer every book that he writes to whatever his own interests are or his own predilections are. And that's what this book becomes as well. So I wondered who was the audience for this? Was this supposed to be gay men or people who are bi? I would say, by the way, the title is not exactly accurate, I guess. I mean, he is. How would you describe Paul? Is he bi? Is he gay? By the end of the book, he's like revulsed by women. I think he says something along those lines. So, what is his sexual orientation, you think, as the book goes along?
Well, again, this is the classic Ed erotic novel.
Yeah.
I like to call it Ed's classy mode, meaning completely classless. Everyone is a bastard, a bitch, or a creep. You've got slobbering, you've got drooling, you've got belching, you've got people don't drink, they slug booze down, they smack their lips when they're drinking their booze. It's sex in filthy alleys. You've got his famous hot nuts. And then like virtually all of the insults are scatological. So,
Right.
Unlike other porno novels of this era, I can't imagine people getting very turned on by what Ed was writing. I mean,
No.
it's like I said, it's almost like anti-eroticism.
And in a way, like,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna. I suspect there are probably a lot of disappointed customers who bought the book expecting one thing, and then as they read it, they were just like, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what people thought they were getting for their money, and if people got their money's worth out of this book or not. But yeah, he takes in a lot of he takes in a lot of really, as you say, unappealing and sometimes disgusting directions. So I always try to determine when I'm reading something by Ed, was he in a good mood or a bad mood when he wrote something? And I think To Make a Homo is one of his bad mood books because, as you say, like every character in this practically is irredeemable and disgusting and unappealing, and everybody's really, really negative. And the novel ends, I would say, in just total despair. It's a very despairing, cynical book. So I think Ed was in a foul mood the few hours he took probably to write this. Although I will say this in Ed's defense here. Overall, I think this was more coherent than his usual. Sometimes he gets very, very incoherent in his books, especially in the novels. He can't stick to a plot or he can't stick to a story outline. This one, I think he tends to hew to the straight and narrow here. There's not as many digressions or diversions from the main path here, and I didn't have any trouble. I didn't have any trouble following the book. It was very coherent, and basically one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. Were there even a lot of? I don't remember that there even were like flashbacks. That's one of the no. That's one of the hallmarks of Ed's incoherent mode is that the characters will flash back to their childhoods, and then there might be a flashback within a flashback, and then you're like, where are we in the timeline here or in the world? But To Make a Homo is not like that at all. He's down to business. It's a dirty business, but he's down to it.
I would say it does, in my opinion, or I don't know, I might be projecting my own reading experience onto his writing experience, but as I read it, I felt like I was pretty engaged, and that there was like a narrative thrust up until about chapter 10, which I think is when he gets to the house, orgy situation where he gets hooked on heroin. After that, um, then it kind of became episodic where it was just different like jobs Paul had or had to go to or whatever. And the book is 17 chapters long. So I would say up through like 10, 11, or 12, it was going along pretty good. And then I felt like it kind of went off a cliff of like repetition, and it seemed like Ed was losing interest and it was getting grosser. And like chapter 11 specifically is the worst, with the where it digresses into one of the guys at the party telling a story about how he has basically raped a homeless guy in a alleyway.
Hubert.
Yeah, Hubert.
What was
Hubert, who he's already described as like a gross guy, right? And then he tells this terrible story that's hard to read, like the by far the worst thing in the book, in my opinion. And then I feel like it never recovers after that. After that, Paul wakes up hungover, and then he goes through a series of encounters that like one grosser than the last, and then it just ends. And so even though it is like a coherent story, I do feel like it kind of goes off a narrative cliff about 75% of the way through.
Right. That's fair. That's fair. One thing that I guess I did admire about that passage of the book, not that story, that horrible story of basically taking advantage of the guy in the alley, which is disgusting. But when Paul comes back to consciousness after this weekend, I did kind of feel like, oh yeah, that's what it would be like if you had this really wild 3-day weekend and they'd been filling you full of heroin all this time, and then you came to on like Monday morning, and you have to remember who you are, where you are. He's trying to be ready when Tommy shows up to pick him up. It's funny to think of a person at this point thinking like, oh, where's my ride, from this horrible experience that I'm having. But that's something that writers will have in like detective novels where the detective gets knocked out or something, and then he comes to. And I think Ed does convey that kind of accurately, probably because Ed blacked out probably a few times in his own life and had that experience of coming back into consciousness. So yeah, I guess.
Well, you said, Joe, they're filling him full of heroin. They're also filling him full of semen that whole entire weekend, to be quite honest. And he on that Monday morning when he wakes up, there's a few lines about how, well, the kind of thing where maybe, and it is a very clear narrative and very clear what's happening just about every step along the way. But then there's a few moments where I'm like, well, what does that mean? And that was one of those moments where it's mentioned that Paul is kind of like, well, Paul is built for this sort of thing, so he doesn't need to go to the doctor to get checked out, which of course is obviously referring to, being repeatedly anally raped, which is what happens. There's no getting around. There's no denying, as Ed might say, there's no denying that this is an incredibly graphic book. And the Hubert scene, to your point, Paul, it is almost hard to read. I was not taking notes, by the way, when I first started reading this. I was just kind of like, I just want to read it and let it flow over me. I started jotting things down along the way because I was like, I can't help it. And one of the things was in that scene with Hubert, quote unquote, the bum in the alley, quote unquote, his gums were as bald as a cue ball. And and Ed is very colorful with his language around some really graphic sexual stuff throughout the book in a, dare I say, entertaining way. That's perhaps terrible to say.
Well, and as Pauline, from the time he arrives at that party and bellies up to the bar till the time when Claude takes him into the room for a little special treatment, There were no less than 10 individual martinis that he drank. And then went into that room with another full pitcher of them. So as far as the indestructibility of various orify, I think the martinis may have played something into that.
Yeah.
And he's
But
and
it's
he's
a
16
wonder
years
he,
old, right?
yeah, it's a
Sorry, go
wonder
ahead.
he was
yeah, but that
functional
is that classic
because
Ed thing, though, of this incredible amount of drinking in
yeah.
compressed periods of time. You'll see.
Yeah. Are they actually drinking martinis from pitchers? Do they have like whole pitchers of
Yeah.
martinis in
Yeah.
this book? Yeah. So they're not even bothering with martini glasses at this point. Although, isn't there also a discussion like, oh, martinis are kind of a sissy's drink and real men drink? I seem to remember something like some character opining that like a real man drinks like just straight liquor and doesn't bother
I
with
can't remember,
cocktails.
although I do know that Paul or Pauline or whichever initially tries a different drink, which I forget, and
Whiskey.
doesn't like it.
Right.
What's
Oh,
that?
yeah.
And
So
then
whiskey.
they give him a martini, and he's like, "Oh, this is way better."
Yeah, I think it was
Yeah.
Hubert that was giving that lecture, Joe, about
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hubert's an interesting. Hubert should. I wish he spun a whole entire book off about Hubert. Hubert seems like an
That would be
interesting
tough to
character.
slog through, though.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, in that alley scene, Ed has a one-off usage of a really obscure word, which was sloop. He describes somebody as a sloop bastard, and sloop is, it's like thin rancid sludge. So it was sort of fitting with the whole alley scene and what transpires there.
Oh, let's go back actually to the very opening scene where Paul is performing oral sex on Tommy, and he starts throwing up during the
Right.
act,
yeah.
and of course it's part of the sexual sort of excitement of the moment. The book. That's why I say it's insanely graphic in a way that, yeah, going back to what we were talking about, 10 minutes ago, the average reader of this sort of thing, are they kind of like, this is a purports
Yeah.
to be a sex book, right?
And yeah, I don't think that they want to read about somebody gagging to the point where they vomit on people. But Ed has this mode that he will go into in his writing that I call wallowing like in the muck. And this is one of those wallowing kind of books. And I was just curious, out of all the books in the Ed Wood literary canon, Greg, I think it was your idea to cover this one in particular. What was it about this book that made you want to cover it?
Well, it came up on my radar recently, and I realized that it's fairly obscure and that really very little has ever been said about it. And I thought, well, this is ideal to, highlight something that, and now perhaps I regret it. No, I'm joking.
No, no.
Actually,
I
so
would suspect
strictly that.
I would suspect the prior sources had only seen like images of the cover. Probably had never even read the thing.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Again, to your point, Jim, earlier, very few people have probably ever read this book much through the years. So let's a little segue real quick. Little Library Press is Bernie Bloom's sort of ripoff of Liverpool Library Press, which was a offshoot of Greenleaf, very big publisher that published tons of sex books going back into the mid 60s, and one of the heavyweights in the marketplace, certainly. So the cover design to make a homo and the logo of Little Library Press really does entirely ape the the look of a Liverpool Library Press book of a similar sort. It was, in fact, and I'm not just saying this, but Leo Eaton told me, because he wrote at least one book for Little Library Press for Bernie, so I know for sure that this was Bernie Bloom's operation. By this point, 71, we're at a sort of, from the timeline standpoint, Michael Thevis is starting to get in increasing hot water. Michael Thevis being the guy who funded Pendulum, the Pendulum West Coast operation with Bernie Bloom. And Bernie's starting to peel away from him by 1971 and start to develop his own sort of moonlighting enterprises, including things like perhaps Little Library Press, perhaps Thevis was still involved to some degree. Any way you look at it, it was a fairly circumscribed line of paperbacks. There wasn't a whole ton of them. The writers included people like Ed. He also wrote Merry-Go-Round for Little Library Press, and Leo Eaton wrote I can't remember the title. It's a Beauty and the Beast sort of knockoff title, but there were others. But one of the hallmarks of Greenleaf Liverpool books at the time was how graphic they were, and certainly this pays that off. Again, if you're going to imitate the sort of big guy on the block, go for it and go for it all the way. And this does that absolutely in spades. Again, we've got Paul Call, who is roughly 16 years old. Tommy Grimes is the pusher in town who sucks Paul into this world. There's that scene. Let's go back actually to the homo notion for a little bit. So there's a scene, maybe it's, I don't remember the actual chapter, but we're a little deeper into it, where Paul does a little reading about quote unquote homosexuality, and he very quickly comes to the conclusion that, yeah, that's me, and it's based strictly upon, male genitalia. Being attracted to male genitalia is the sort of main allure that convinces him that I must be a homosexual. To your point, though, Joe, he sleeps with Mary Kolaski off and on throughout this book over and over again, right?
Yeah, I don't know why, but during his session with her, his first one at the church picnic, I was thinking of that song "Son of a Preacher Man" by Dusty Springfield. I don't know why that song was playing in my head when I was going through that passage. It's kind of like, because that song is about, teenagers exploring their sexuality for the first time, and except this is like that's like Dusty's version is like I guess the sexy or positive version of it. This is like the degrading and degraded version of it. And I was thinking if there are any admirable or likable characters in this, and I'm going to nominate Paul's dad as one of the more admirable characters. But Jim, you are frowning, but I mean.
Yeah, so Paul's dad, of course, though, he's got there's the segment initially where when he finds out his son has gotten Mary Kolaski pregnant, right. Paul's dad has, he has these various negative things to say about the Kolaskis. Well, but he's also sort of thinking out loud to himself about, wow, how good it would be to have a hot young daughter that you could be farming out for sex to men to make some cash. So I wouldn't go so far.
Well, I guess so.
Now, and I realize what you're saying is sort of a relative statement, right? Like
in this book,
in this universe, right?
Because at least he doesn't like beat the crap out of his son for this. And
right, he takes it right. It's just matter of fact and like, hey, be smarter next time and use a condom.
And he forks over what I guess is, what is it, $10,000 or
$1,000?
$1,000.
A lot of money.
A lot of money
for
that
one, right?
It's like $1,000 to keep quiet about it, and like
$250
something on top of that for the abortion.
Something like that.
Which the abortion doesn't, at least in the time frame of the book, the abortion actually doesn't seem to take place, right? We're still
because
right.
I think Mary stays
enough topics in this book to offend all of you watching.
I think Mary stays pregnant for the rest of the book, and in fact is described as being showing. So like, okay.
She talks about her bump not showing quite enough to where people would know for sure.
Yeah. So I don't know if any of you have any experience going to church picnics. Is that what they're like? Did I miss out? But
I've been to a few. The best thing about the ones I used to go to is someone would always bring Kentucky Fried Chicken, and it was always the best thing in the buffet.
Good.
Absolutely.
But
that's the most exciting thing I ever had.
Well, maybe if you'd gotten away from the main, picnic and gone off into the bushes. So I don't know. Maybe I was missing out as a youth.
And of course they get, well, what happens in the first two chapters are, consecutive on the timeline of the book. It's all at the picnic. So Paul has this forced sex scene where he gives Tommy a blowjob, and then he's left hanging, and he's beating off in the woods. And Mary
Yeah.
Kolaski happens to have been watching all along. It's many, many chapters later we realize that this was actually
Whole thing was a setup.
all entirely a setup to bring Paul into their criminal heroin pushing scheme,
And,
which
Oh
and
yeah.
the extent of the setup or the intent of the setup is also a little muddy, because at one point she says something that seems like she's implying the money was that they get from his father was also kind of
Yes. Yeah.
a part of the deal. Like she was planning to get it, which means I guess she was planning to either get pregnant on purpose or say she was pregnant, in which
Right.
case she wouldn't have to actually be pregnant. She could just say someone. And
right.
I think even later she says she threatens to say, well, if we don't sleep together, I'll just tell them we did and I'll get more money out of
Right.
you. But I think it's this like, never rewriting and just making things up as you go along, that several possibilities are all true at once, and Ed doesn't commit to
Well,
any of them.
And again,
later.
it's the classic somebody being set up that Ed likes. It's the people, the main characters declaiming any ability to have agency in their lives, right?
Mhm.
Paul is just like, well, he's the bigger boy. I better do what he tells me.
And
It's
Yeah.
better, I guess, to go down on Tommy and have all these bad things happen than potentially beaten up by him. This is now I'm seeing this as the classic Ed Wood thing, that his characters, and it makes me wonder about what he thought about his own life, right? This complete lack
Well,
of agency. It's just like
it
the
makes
world is happening to you and you don't have
yeah.
really any control over it.
it makes me wonder almost if it's I mean, a narrative device, or also like potentially a psychological thing, to your point, where if something is not your fault, then it's okay. So like if being gay is wrong, but someone's making me do it, then it's okay that I'm doing it. Or if, these feelings I'm having are wrong, but they're being forced upon me, then oh well, I may as well go with it. But it's not my fault. This isn't who I really, you know what I mean?
Right.
There's a lot of that in there.
A couple of things interesting related to that. At one point, a little later in the book, he arrives at the conclusion, Paul, that I think I love Tommy, right? He literally
Mm-hmm.
starts talking about thinking that he loves Tommy, he loves his abuser. Kind of interesting. At the same time, he never seems particularly disturbed by his own sexual proclivities. He doesn't really get too hung up on it, whether he is or
Mhm.
isn't gay, or whether he does or does not like putting on his sister's clothing, which we
Oh
haven't
wait.
gone there yet.
Okay,
And
that's a whole other
No.
thing.
that
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Joe, before you go
Yeah. Go
next,
ahead.
one of the most I would vote Gloria as probably the most sympathetic character in the book.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
that goes to something. This is Ed had put his name on the front cover of this thing, but he didn't need to, because there are so many of his classic themes that are in this book, and that the story of the brother who becomes obsessed with his sister's femininity and his sister's clothing, and then wanting to admire himself in the mirror. That is something that is in a lot of Ed Wood books and short stories, and it goes back to Glehnard Glenda. It's where he borrows the sister's sweater or sister's dress to go to the Halloween party. And the other thing about, you've all mentioned that Paul is a very passive character until I guess the very, very end of this book, where he finally decides to really, I don't know, even he decides to take action. I think even then
Yeah, it's mostly Mary. Yeah.
Mary is doing it, but he's a very passive character. He's just kind of just buffeted about by the winds in this book. Um, but there is a point at which Mary later uh, almost all but blackmails him into having sex with her, or performing a sex act with him. And I thought, wow, that is something that Ed likes to write about in his screenplays as well. If you think of The Violent Years and Fugitive Girls, there's both scenes where the female gang forces a guy to have sex with them. And, like the guy is, as you say, has no agency. And when they covered the violent years on Mystery Science Theater 3000, they said, about how unlikely that is and how that never will happen. And young men, put this out of your minds, because this will never happen to you, where a female gang is going to drag you off into the woods and force you to have sex with them. They said, concentrate on your studies, don't even think about this ever happening to you, because it won't. But that's something I noticed, like, oh, that's a motif in Ed's writing. The sexually aggressive women who all but force the passive man to have sex with them. But you know what? Ed Wood movie, of all of them, this book reminded me of the most. And hear me out on this, is Jailbait, because of the relationship of Tommy to Paul and Mary. You have this like little trio of crime. And just like in Jailbait, of course, you have Vic Brady, the surly, mean, aggressive gangster, and then the younger boy who, falls under his spell, Don Gregor, who, like Paul, is from a good home, has a rich dad. Well, not, Paul's dad isn't rich in this, I guess, but by the standards of this town, he's supposed to be kind of like somewhat well off. And then you have the gun moll, the Theodora Thurman, I've forgotten her character name in Jailbait, but you have that trilogy of characters in Jailbait, and then you have sort of a similar trilogy of characters in this book. And I thought that the relationship of Vic Brady and Don Gregor is very similar to Tommy and Paul in this one, because like Vic Brady is always surly, he's always a jerk, he's always mean, he's always getting Tommy's always getting Paul into more and more trouble, just like Vic is always getting Don into more and more trouble as this goes along. So I would have recognized this, I think, if it had come to me without a title or anything. And we were talking, as Ed Wood's work, and we were talking about the passivity of Don's. We're talking about the passivity of the Paul character, and I think it's telling that this book is called "To Make a Homo." Mm-hmm. It's not that he's becoming homosexual; it's that he's being forced into it, and he doesn't have any strongly held beliefs, I guess, of his own. So he's just sort of clay that can be molded into something. And I think that's what happens to him over the course of this.
I think Joe, he does, though, in my mind, actively pursue dressing in women's clothes, and that's stealing Gloria's clothing. There's the scene in the kitchen with mom where go make me a sandwich, because he wants to get into the yesterday's. He's wearing for.
I thought that was a little nervy on his part. I thought
he's wearing yesterday's panties.
That's a common ruse.
I thought that was a pretty nervy moment on his part, where he's already in trouble right now at this point in his life. Things are already bad, and the mom is already kind of wary of him, or she doesn't like that he gets into all this trouble, and she's not as sympathetic to him as the dad is. And
one of the points that was, well, two things to Paul's earlier point about if I don't have any control over the situation, it's okay if I do it. We see the parallel you'll see of, men who are sent to prison, right? Suddenly situational homosexuality can often be considered okay in that context. Whereas if the guy would never consider doing it outside of that context, right? But now it's suddenly okay because of the circumstances I'm in. But the one little thread that Ed hinted at that was never explored is there's a point at which Paul starts to think about that he might have to start stealing some clothing and undergarments from girls around town. So I was briefly thinking this was going down the line of this might be heading down the line of sort of the stalker serial killer kind of thing, where the guy's starting to break into homes and stealing the undergarments of his classmates and their moms, but that never appeared in the book.
That's exactly when you said it, Jim. That's exactly what jumped into my mind. I just watched a documentary about the Golden State Killer a week or two ago, and he, of course, started out as the ransacker,
Yeah.
doing exactly what you said. Yeah.
So early on, when I was saying I thought this was going in one direction and then it went in another, and I thought there was a better story in here. That's exactly what it was.
Oh, okay.
When to rewind a little bit, and sorry, I had audio problems, so I might have missed some of the things you said. So if I repeat stuff, sorry. But so early on, obviously, it starts off where the title of the book seems to be making sense, right? From the very beginning of the book. Then it backs off really quickly and gets into all the stuff about cross-dressing. And there's long passages where, unless you equate homosexuality with cross-dressing, which you shouldn't necessarily, as we learned from Glenn or Glenda, there's way less homosexual stuff and way more fetishizing women's clothing and dressing up as a woman and being turned on by yourself when you're dressed as a woman and so on, to the point where he can't be aroused unless it's perfect, unless his outfit is and his makeup and stuff is perfect. So it's like 100% definitely a fetish, you know? And that's when he starts thinking, you know, it's escalating. I need more clothes. I can't just keep stealing my sister's clothes. I need to start taking stuff from girls at school, to your point. And I thought, well, that would be a unique and interesting story if the whole rest of this went in the direction of him enacting his plan to like ransack girls' lockers at school. And like, you know, then people are on to, you know, they start noticing things are missing, and then he starts getting nervous about it, but he can't, you know, he can't shake the addiction and all this kind of stuff. But almost as soon as it gets brought up, it never pays off. It goes in the totally different direction, almost like he had to snap back and make sure he wrote to make a homo instead of, and even then it's still not really to make a homo, but yeah, it just seems so interesting, the idea of like a 16 or 17-year-old guy entering into a secret life of stealing all his classmates' clothing, you know. But it wasn't to be, unfortunately.
I'm sure that was quite is quite commonplace, as a matter of fact, now that you say it. Yeah, that would have been an interesting road to go down. You said addiction. You're talking about addiction to the clothing, of course, but there's also the heroin addiction, which apparently it takes quote unquote 3 days or so of giving them the needle before that makes you a total junkie. And there's also you know, pot smoking here, marijuana.
Yeah.
And it's not something that comes up a lot in Ed. And there's a general notion that Ed was anti-drugs and things like that, but it's presented here in a, dare I say, positive fashion, if that makes sense.
Isn't there though? Somebody says it sure as heck leads to other things.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah,
like
it's a gateway drug. Yeah.
It's the classic gateway.
right.
It's what you like. They didn't have DARE back then, but when I was in elementary school, they had the DARE program, and they would always say, you know, pushers will try to hook you on something innocuous, and then it'll lead to harder stuff. And they'll be doing it on purpose, like Tommy's doing. It's not like you're interested in drugs, so you go to check them out, or you want to party or whatever. It's like someone specifically seeks you out, gets you hooked on the easy stuff, and for free. And it goes from there.
I really enjoyed the not so slyly named Hemp's candy store that they were dealing the drugs out.
Here's another plot thread that they sort of set up and then they don't really pay off. Is the kid who finds himself being part of the mob, and one of the first tasks they give you is take this package to this guy at this street at this time. And I was thinking another Mystery Science Theater movie, I Accuse My Parents, where
that's one of the best ones.
Yeah, it's a great movie and it's a great episode. And it's where this is a young, naive guy who is like delivering packages to different people, and he doesn't realize he's joined the mob, you know, basically because he thinks that these are just I don't know what he thinks he's delivering to people. In this book, he thinks he's delivering cigarettes or something. And it also reminded me, like, there's a Fat Albert episode where like the local drug pusher is having kids take packages around for him. And so I thought, I don't know if this has ever happened in real life, but I keep seeing it happen in popular culture where, you know, like your initiation into the mob and into the world of crime is you start out as a delivery boy and you're delivering these mysterious packages. The other thing, though, I was wondering that his box, I guess, of marijuana, a box of marijuana cigarettes, his box of joints gets damaged slightly during his tryst with Mary. And later, Tommy beats the crap out of him for it. And I was just thinking, like, it's pot. Can't you just wrap it up again? Or like, how badly did they get? Like, what happened to those? What happened to that pot during that? You know, when it got crumpled a little bit or something, it somehow became totally unusable. And now he has to like
joints got bent, right?
Yeah, it was like you can just you can just unwrap it, rewrap it. I don't see what the huge deal is that they make out of this, but yeah, there's a little bit of a reefer madness a feel to this, where it's the young, innocent high school kids. Although I keep saying that Paul is young and innocent. I don't know what he was like before this story. The story sort of starts with him just in the midst of being debauched here. So I don't know what he was like before this. If he was a goody two shoes.
Well, it's interesting because in the first couple pages, it seems like he's an innocent who's being taken advantage of. But then as his inner monologue goes, he starts talking about like, well, I've been with girls before. I've never gone all the way, but I've been like totally naked with them before and seen their private, like everything except sex basically is kind of what he's saying. And which I would think a lot of people his age probably haven't experienced. And so it is a weird, like, again, Ed's kind of amorphously having it both ways where this guy is innocent, but also has experience, but kind of doesn't, but kind of does. And it's hard to figure out.
There's so much sort of, to your point, Paul, there's so much sort of left off the table. It just starts immediately in this scene with him, he and Tommy at the church picnic out in the woods. At first, we don't even know they're at the church picnic. Of course, the minister's a little stinger in the tail of chapter 1, the minister's, or is it chapter 2, actually, right?
I think it's like at the end of one of the chapters.
It's chapter 2. He and Mary are, making the beast with two backs, and Miss Lavenmore or something.
Oh, Mrs.
yeah,
I like that little moment.
Right. Oh, there's also,
oh my goodness,
jumping way down the road. There's also Davy Lane, right? What about Davy Lane? Think about that one, right? And vis-a-vis Shirley Lane. And Mary talks about how her and Tommy had a threesome with Davy Lane. And that's intriguing. Apropos of, nothing. It is very circumscribed, the narrative, in a way that shuts out a real world. It gets as far as the real world of people like Claude and Hubert and these guys who have these martini parties and stuff like that. But we don't. It's again very in some sort of interesting bubble.
And once you get there, where Tommy's essentially pimping out Paul, I had to remind myself, like, okay, Tommy is an 18-year-old drug dealing, heroin dealing pimp. And Paul is his like 16-year-old prostitute, and Mary is, I think, 15-year-old other prostitute / lover / slave. It's crazy when you put it in that context.
So that was the other
even in like Reefer Madness and stuff, and they had adults that were the ringleaders.
So my thought was, does this constitute kiddie porn nowadays? We've got description of 15 and 16-year-olds having sex, right? If you printed this nowadays, is that even legal?
Yeah, you would. Yeah. Oh yeah, this would, I think, run into challenges right away because he's very explicit in that, in being very specific about the ages, especially for Mary. So again, this is one of those books that even though it has Ed Wood's name right on the cover, I think has like a zero chance of being reissued or made mainstream again or brought to the public's attention again. I think this might be the last time it's ever reviewed anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and it's all about context, because like if you're talking about like a young adult novel about the coming of age of a couple
Right.
teenagers and the first time they ever, get together and stuff, that would be one thing. Or if it was a literary novel about, but since it specifically was written and marketed to try to titillate people, that's where you run into trouble. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even if it's not really, if it's anti-erotic, but
because this came in that early 70s window where it was just like Thunderdome, no rules.
Right on.
Right.
Pendulum. I've got this one book Pendulum put out that the entire book is the entire premise of it is underage sex stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just teenagers with other teenagers.
Yeah.
So
I think the only thing
but that window closed. I would hesitate
sure.
to say when it closed by exactly, but certainly by the mid 80s it was closed.
The only thing that sort of takes the curse off it is that Ed knows, I don't think has any affinity for what teenagers are like or how they talk or how they act at all. This is definitely written from the perspective of a middle-aged man and written for grown men to read. So the kids in this aren't really like kids at all. I don't think we ever see them in school. No, we do see them in school a little, like he's coming out of school or something, but they don't have like kids' lives. They don't talk or act like kids. I didn't think of them as like, if God forbid this book had ever been made into a movie, I think you'd have to cast actors like in their mid-20s to play these characters, because there's nothing realistically teenage about any of this. So
Well, and it is so anti-erotic. I mean, what it makes me think of is the very first hardcore porn magazine I saw when I was quite young. The photographs were of people you did not want to see naked.
right.
It was half of the shock of it was the people themselves. It wasn't the spectacle of what was occurring, And I think the scenes that Ed writes are the same way. Which again makes me think that anybody, picking this up once they start reading it is probably disappointed because they bought it for another
well,
purpose entirely.
it's interesting because it's almost like everything is equal in a way. Like if you talk about who's the audience for this or what's the intent or whatever, it's almost like anything you couldn't put in a normal book is what they want to put in this book. So whether it's shitting your pants or vomiting or
Oh,
raping
yeah.
someone or gay sex or cross-dressing or straight sex or pregnant teenagers, it's like anything taboo is equally worth putting in. It's not like I want to specifically target someone for a specific reason. It's like this notion that everything is equal, put it in, someone's going to like it, who cares if someone else
Yeah.
doesn't? You know what I mean? It's crazy.
Well,
Well, maybe
it's like some of those pendulum photo books you have where there's both heterosexual and gay sex depicted in it, right? And yet you'd be thinking this might be something a heterosexual man would buy. And like you said, Joe, on one of the other discussions, right? Black Myth. It's like, well, gosh, what would they have gotten out of the last 40 pages of that where it was just gay sex photos, right? It's that same thing, as you say, Paul, of just it's all in there.
Yeah, maybe that was the audience, just people who were just down for anything, anything sexual. I guess just like have a buffet or a smorgasbord, and you go around and you take what you want out of this. I thank you, Paul. I'd forgotten about the pants shitting
Oh
scene
yeah.
in this. They don't dwell on it, but it does happen.
So
Um,
I actually did take notes, and I took copious notes about the pants shitting. And
Very nice.
I don't know if you guys noticed, but all right. So I have to
What
remind
chapter was
myself.
that again? Do you remember?
Oh boy.
I remember it was yellow panties. That, of course, made it
Well,
very vivid in my mind.
it's kind of revisionist history because it's around 5 or 6.
Okay, yeah, I hear it. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And so he sleeps with Mary outside the school, which distracts him from his drug delivering errand and leads to him crushing the marijuana cigarettes. Then he meets Tommy in an alley, and Tommy beats him up, and he shits his pants because he's beat up so hard. Then later, shortly after, the author reveals that Paul had been wearing women's underwear for several days. And so by that rationale, he was wearing women's underwear when he slept with Mary. So Mary didn't notice. And then when he was beat up by Tommy, he was also wearing women's underwear. So he shit the women's underwear, right?
Right.
Which he presumably got from his sister, because he didn't turn into the ransacker ever. So now, but it never deals with, see, this is what I would think would be an interesting book. How do you, like, him sneaking around? Like, should I just throw these away? Should I try to wash them? Have I ever done laundry in my life? Does my mom do my laundry for me? Will my sister find out? All this kind of stuff, but it's not, it's only addressed that he was wearing them. It's not addressed the complications of shitting them would bring into your life,
right,
or of wearing them when you sleep with a woman who doesn't realize you're dressing like a woman. That doesn't come up either. Well, later it comes up, but not in this sequence. So I thought him deciding after the fact that Paul had been wearing panties for several days threw a lot of question marks into the previous couple chapters. But he clearly wasn't thinking about these things.
And when Tommy confronts Paul in that initial moment before he beats him up, is one of the odder sentences that Ed has. And maybe it's just a typo, but he says, he squeezed Paul's shoulder to emphasize his words and adhesive tones.
Yeah, I thought that was very vivid, sort of interesting writing of a very unique sort. Adhesive tones. I picked up on that too, Jim. That's cool.
Well, my favorite little turn of phrase, I think he uses the term penis invasion at one point in the book. I think that was, but the funny thing about this,
Joe, this is getting to your whole thing about king hats.
Yes.
And coining these phrases for things that we already got words for.
Ed's 2-worders and 3-worders are all through this. If he doesn't have a good term for something, he'll just throw 2 words together. But one of the odd things about this book is, he tries to pace it for a novel. We got to keep moving along, have another plot point. But sometimes he will slow down and describe something in excruciating detail. And the passage that I'm thinking of is like sort of a secret masturbatory session that Paul has. And then there's like the elaborate cleanup afterwards, like cleaning himself up and getting the women's clothing back in its rightful place. And like, Ed, come on. Like, you're going on about this and on and on and on about this for pages and pages. Like, why are you spending so much time? Why is this the thing that you focus on for so long? And this very unerotic post-masturbation cleanup session, like, why is this going on and on and on? So I only can imagine that, I don't know, that I can't say that this was something from Ed Wood's own past. Although this thing with the mirror, where he has to be in front of a mirror, that's in too many of his movies and too many of his books to be a coincidence. This thing about, I don't know if in his apartments that Ed ever had one of those full-length mirrors. I always picture it as being one of those mirrors that you have, like, where it's on a stand and you can sort of tilt it either way, and it's the length of your body. He writes about those so often in his books and stories. I have to wonder, like, was that a real thing? And I think maybe if you see those like there's home movies of Ed like in drag at home, and I'll have to look through those again to see if there's an actual scene of him in front of a mirror. But
I don't remember that, but he definitely, the way he carries himself and like his posture and the way he like touches himself and stuff, not touches himself, but touches,
Yeah.
it definitely looks like he's really playing up like, look how sexy I am, look how sexy I
Yeah,
feel, whether like maybe the
well,
camera is the mirror, but
I
I definitely
okay,
get that vibe.
this is another thing that Ed does, and he does again in this book, and I don't think this is a thing in real life at all. But his idea that if a man is in convincing enough drag, a woman who is a lesbian will take him on as a lover. Like that's good enough, I think there's even a point at which I forgot who says it to him, but make lesbian love to me. We haven't even talked about the episodic second half of this book where he's just being pimped out, and there's the long, strange passage where he and Mary are pimped out to a rich old lady, a Madam Elise Hodsworth or something. And I thought if this book were made into a movie, that's the part Ed would have played. Ed would have wanted to play. He likes to have like these. Sometimes they're men. In this case, it's a woman. The debauched old time pervert, who feeds on the young kids and likes to, Ed has that in a lot of his books and stories. So Elise, I think, is a very typical kind of character, and it doesn't really serve any. I don't think any purpose in the book other than it's an incident that happens that shows you how deep Paul is getting into the lifestyle. But yeah, Madam Elise Hodsworth is one of those characters that stood out to me as very, very Woody. And
It's another dowager for you, Joe. I
yeah,
know you
yeah,
like the dowager sex.
yeah,
That
Dowager.
sequence, that sequence kind of reminded me of My Own Private Idaho. If any of you guys
Okay,
have
yeah,
seen that, in a weird way.
I have
yeah.
seen that. That's about drugs and sex and prostitution as well, actually.
Hey,
Right. So,
Ed
They
would have
get
liked that movie.
right.
yeah. At
I
one point, I don't remember the specifics, but the two young prostitutes get delivered to someone's house, of a rich person's house, and so on and so forth. But anyway, it's off topic.
No, I thought, and I can't believe I'm actually going to bring this up because everybody's going to be like, Greg, you're really seriously fucked up that you even thought this. But you know the scene where Ed, uh, as Glenda is regarding, the shop window in Glen or
Right.
Glenda. There are moments in that scene I've literally freeze framed things and zoomed in and things like that where he's kind of running his hands down along the front of his sweater and running his hands down along to where the crease of the skirt is, and it looks like he has a fucking hard on. I'm not
wouldn't doubt it.
right.
Like,
And I think like to him, he was maybe getting off on that idea of
yeah,
I'm standing in the street right now and people are filming me and isn't this great? Because there's a moment later on where Paul, I think, mentions something in the book like and I I didn't even see a little bit of a whatever. Going back real quick, guys. So that is settled law, by the way. This is entirely free speech, so theoretically you could put this out today
okay.
without a problem. Reason being, I won't get into the details, but I hooked somebody up with lawyers at the Free Speech Coalition regarding old adult paperbacks a couple of years ago, and they're like, look, as long as it's not somebody actually claiming that they did these things, if they're writing fiction, it is entirely settled law. I think the settled law really is rooted in, I think, William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, which went before the Supreme Court in roughly like 1964, which is 1,000 times more graphic than this is, as a matter of fact.
Well,
Nuts.
and Joe, Madame Elise again. We've got shades of Madame Rose, right? It's this older woman,
Right.
Yeah.
um, sort of. I hesitate to say barrel shaped, but they're sort of a type. And of course, she has this little soliloquy she does where and this happens a couple of times in the book where Ed regales us with some interesting sexual knowledge. Um, you know, like you just need to tug on your penis enough to get it longer, and girls' breasts will get bigger from boys pawing at them regularly. And other little nuggets of helpful fact.
So I thought it was interesting along those lines. At one point, Mary, late in the book, there's a sex scene between Paul and Mary is saying specifically when the penis head hits her uterus, that's where the heavy passion comes in. And first of all, that's insane. But secondly, I mean, there's the cervix, right? I'm not a gynecologist, but I have heard it that is painful if the cervix gets hit with something. And so not only that, shortly after that, Paul thinks that Mary feels like hot fired up sandpaper.
Yes,
which sounds awful, but it's said in a way that it's supposed to sound good. It's almost like the 40-year-old virgin is talking about sex. It's
I'll give you for the benefit of listeners, I'll give the exact quote. Mine tightens around yours, which is swelling, and the head hits that uterus like nothing else in this world. That's when I shoot off. You make all the friction, even though the cunt is all gooey, like hot fired up sandpaper.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to think of
again. It's one of those statements that's like, gosh, we know Ed had sex, but it ends up being one of those statements he makes that makes you wonder if he ever had sex.
But by the way, reminds me, before we get off of it, the old what was her name? Madam something.
Madam Elise Hodsworth.
Yes,
Madam Elise.
I believe one of her anecdotes was some observational humor about getting your penis stuck in your zipper.
Yeah, I think that happens.
Or was it Paul? Someone was saying.
Someone says that. Yeah.
The greatness of women's clothing is that the zipper is on the side of the dress, and that way you never zip up your penis. And I thought that was an interesting digression to talk about the horrors of zipping your penis up.
Yeah, but how often does that happen, really?
Well, we've seen there's something about Mary, that is obviously a problem in that movie. By the way,
that's a movie, right? So,
but I don't know. It could have been inspired by
verging into too much information. I can say this has happened to me once in life when I was really super drunk.
Okay. Which Ed was. You see, that's a problem for Ed. You see, he probably had that problem all the time.
Only once,
Well, for me, I had like footy pajamas when I was like 4 years old or something that had a zipper that went all the way up the front. And I got pinched and it was bad times. Ouch. But also people used to zip up, like when I was little, zip up my jacket and it might pinch my neck and that would hurt real bad. So
this was college. I can't claim that level of innocence. This was college for me and I was just drunker than a skunk. And a significant injury occurred, but you got over it. It only happened once, so I don't know. It just seemed like
By the way,
the other thing was I liked the segment. Ed had this in that same area. We had this little argument against condoms.
Oh yeah, about how you don't feel as much
because that women only really got off from them internally feeling spraying your joy juice all over their interior, and that if you held it in with the condom, that really took a lot off the act. As he said, she wouldn't be able to blast off like crazy without feeling
blast
that
off is a phrase
juice.
That's used throughout this book, and it's first used, I think, for smoking marijuana. I think is when you blast off, and I'm thinking of
4 or 5 times we hear blast off for different reasons, right? At least 4 or 5 times, if not more.
I'm thinking of there's a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie called The Blast Off Girls. And I only going into that movie, I only knew the title, so I assumed my naivete. I thought, did he write a science fiction book or something? Did he write a science fiction movie where these girls are going to go out into outer space and have sex with aliens or something? No, it's just the blast off girls are just girls who get high and it's really, so blasting off, I guess, is, I don't know if anybody really used that term in real life or if that's just a thing that filmmakers and writers used.
Isn't there also, Joe, there's that There's various iterations of it. There's the magazine version, there's also the paperback version. It's a photo shoot with John Holmes and Neola Graff and a few other people. And the title of the magazine version that has the photo feature in it is Blast Off. And not again, not necessarily related in
Right.
any way to Ed Wood, but again, people that he was working with right around that same time frame. And in matter of fact, now it's a painful subject now. Both the paperback and the magazine had come up on eBay many years ago for fairly cheaply, and I had foregone buying them, and they've gotten a lot more expensive since. So that's actually a painful subject. So
Well,
Blast
by
Off.
the way, I'll cheer you up here. If we're talking about great quotes from this book, there's one that should never be overlooked, and it's right here. It says, "You'd shit green if you ate spinach regular." That
Right.
is a quote. He said similar things in other books. Sometimes it's just "you'd shit if you ate regular," but this one is "you'd shit green if you ate spinach regular."
Well,
So
I couldn't help it. I couldn't help jotting a few things down as time wore on as I was reading this. His jaws like those of a Gila monster, like during a blowjob, obviously. And then there was he sniffed at the crotch of the panties, then put that area of the material into his mouth and began to chew them like gum. So, very, very
So
nice.
predated,
They're
just as
also
an FYI, predating 1950, and I can't say by how much, but the word blast was definitely associated with marijuana.
I was
So to blast would be to smoke a joint, or blast the roach was smoking a
okay.
joint. So
I
how
would have thought
far
of like
back that goes, I don't know.
I would have thought in like the 40s and 50s it would mean to get drunk, because isn't there like getting blasted, like blasting off? I would think. I
there
For
is
some reason.
some crossover like a
Helpful source for all you geeks out
Oh, that's
there
cool.
from
American
1950.
underworld lingo.
1950. Amazing read.
That is really cool. Well, vocabulary is a big thing for Ed. He wrote a lot of articles about like getting to know the terminology. He would write some articles that are just glossaries, and he would include glossaries in a couple of his books. So the idea that the terms are not known to people, that there's like all these fetishes and sexual proclivities and all of these terms that people don't know. And in his nonfiction articles, like the ones in When the Topic is Sex, he repeatedly states that these terms are being kept hidden away. There's secret language. There's a secret language of sex and sexuality, and it's being kept away behind locked doors. There's a secret room of the library or something where these books all where the books with the magic words all are. And I think that's even in this book where Paul is very unschooled in this world, and he doesn't know the vocabulary, and he doesn't even know like he couldn't some of this stuff like uh, couldn't he just guess it from context? But no,
yeah.
Paul doesn't strike me as being very, very bright in this. He does not seem like the sharpest. He ain't the sharpest tool in the shed, as they say. And I guess in his own way, Tommy is, I wouldn't call him smart, but he has sort of a street smarts or
Yeah.
cunning. Uh, and again, what he reminds me of more than anything in the Ed Wood canon is Vic Brady. Vic Brady, who is this sullen, surly jerk who treats everyone around him horribly, and yet, Don admires him greatly. And one of my great unfinished Ed Wood projects to be done sometime in the year 2033 or something is a novelization of Jailbait. And one of the things that I was going to add was that Vic Brady and Don actually also had a sexual relationship.
Uh-oh.
That Vic Brady,
Joe,
because
are you trying to tell us something with this fan fiction?
no, I was saying like, well, I was thinking like, why does the movie's explanation is that Don is just a bored rich kid and he wants something to do. And the most exciting option is hanging out with Vic Brady, who's this gangster, and they're going to go out and do crimes together. Not that Don needs the money, but that it's exciting to him to do this. And I thought, oh, what if what if they also had a sexual relationship? What if he was, if Vic Brady had also coerced him into, a sexual relationship? And I probably now, having read this book, I would also have Vic Brady get Don hooked on drugs. I think that would be another thing.
That's good.
And then for the Theodora Thurman character, I was going to say in my book, she's going to be basically a lesbian, and she's like, and she and Vic are just beards for each other, like they're, because I don't know, in the movie, they seem to have a passionate relationship, but I never saw like what Vic's appeal is. He just seems like a jerk to me. And that's the same thing with Tommy. Tommy is just, does Tommy, by the way, have like other sort of henchmen or thugs? It feels like he
it's implied, I think, that he's running a bunch of people, right?
Yeah. And doesn't he have like a group of people with him, at least in the opening? Doesn't he have at least someone else? I don't know if he has any lieutenants with him. He seems to spend most of his time or all of his time with Mary and Paul as the book goes along. But I thought of him as sort of a, I don't know, Artful Dodger or whatever, or Fagin or something, that he's got like, he's running people all over town. But yeah, that style that kind of character must have appealed to Ed too, because there's a story, I think I want to call it in the Stony Lonesome. There's sort of a story about maybe it's not that story, but I'm going to say it's in the Stony Lonesome, where there's a kind of character who's a teenage bully and jerk, and he's like pushing everybody around and having sex with all the girls at the graveyard. And then the comeuppance at the end of the story is that I think like the dead bodies come up and drag him down with them. So that must have appealed to Ed, that kind of character who can just be surly and mean and angry and,
Well, they're self-made, right? I mean,
right.
In Ed's world, regardless of what you think about what it is they're doing in particular, right? They're not the victims of their circumstance. They're dictating what's going on around them, both Vic and Tommy. And it reminds me of the quote from at the opening of Goodfellas, as the young boys recalling what attracted him to the mobsters in the neighborhood, and he says they were somebodies in a neighborhood of nobodies.
Right.
They didn't have to, they didn't bend a knee to anybody. They dictated what was going on in their daily life, and that alone, despite the activity itself may be, could be attractive. That this is somebody who's just projecting that kind of strength.
We haven't talked much about the geographic setting of this, I don't think, during this podcast, but it all takes place in a small town, I'm saying, called Clinton, and I didn't know where it was supposed to be. We were talking, I think, before we went on the air here, that it might be a stand-in for Poughkeepsie, Ed's hometown. In the opening passages, I thought this was going to be another one of those books that was set in the South somewhere, because I kind of thought like, oh, there's a little bit of dialect or vernacular, in the way that the characters are talking to each other, but it doesn't turn out to be that at all. And again, that kind of reminds me of Jailbait again, which does not necessarily take place in Los Angeles proper. It seems to just take place in some city somewhere. I don't even think they name the city in Jailbait. It just seems to be some town somewhere. It doesn't seem to be happening in like in the heart of a huge city. It doesn't seem to be taking place in like New York or Los Angeles. It's just happening in some town. And the town in this seems to be, it's called Clinton. And I think Clinton is only named once, I think, in the entire book. So, yeah, it could be anywhere. And maybe that's the point of it, is that, for that matter, like, where does Reefer Madness, is that all supposed to be happening? That's just supposed to be some town somewhere. It could be anywhere USA. So I guess that's what's happening here. And you can say that no one rises up too high on the economic level, on the economic ladder in this town, because if Paul and his family are supposed to be, they're the fat cats that you would target with a very elaborate scam like this, you're trying to reel him in and get his money and turn him into a heroin addicted gay prostitute. Like, if that family, and they're described as not being that rich, they have enough money that they can pay off Mary, but they're not like
I,
economic superpowers either.
I think, Joe, the upper crust would be people like Claude, right?
Oh yeah, I
Or Ms. Hodsworth or
yeah,
Hodworth,
I guess
you know?
there is sort of. Does she live in a mansion or something? Did they say that she
Yeah.
lives, she lives in a mansion? Well, that's another thing that Ed likes to have, like the old rich person who lives in a like the big house up on the top of the hill. Um, I think that's, that's the fantasy of the small town, the small town poor person is like, one day I'm going to have the big house up on the top of the hill. And
And again, Ed with his names, her last name is Hodworth, which is actually a very unusual English last name, but is a minor noble family. It's an actual family. So again, I think he's picking these things from various places. It's not just accidental.
Speaking of names, I thought it was funny. I mean, we've said Paul Call several times. It's Coll. We first realized that's his last name when it introduces his sister because it says, Gloria Call was brushing her hair or something like that. Excuse me. So you then piece together, oh, this guy is Paul Call. And then you wonder, well, is it Cole or something? I mean, Paul Call seems like a funny name for Ed to choose. Then you think, well, his once he gets into cross dressing, his female persona is Pauline, and then his Pauline Call, which is almost Pauline Kael, which is
Pauline,
famous film critic
Pauline
that
Kael.
Ed may or may not have been aware of. Uh,
Well, Ed loves those names that have very obvious male female versions. So as soon as I saw, oh, there's a character named Paul, I thought, oh, well, what's it going to be? Pauline, Paulette, Paula. Eventually, we're gonna get to something like that. So, but he also likes Gloria, obviously, as a name. That's another name that he likes. But I just remember something about Mary that I think is interesting in this book. Mary and her family. Um, they are supposed to be like the trashiest family in town,
Mhm.
and Paul's dad is sort of prejudiced against them right from the start. And then Ed, I think, would support the dad every step of the way in that prejudice, because it's like this is like the no class family in town, and the hatred for them is totally justified. They're just the worst. So these people who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, they're also just horrible people. And so we get kind of grotesque scenes of what Mary's family life might be like. And I'm thinking of a Monty Python sketch called "The Most Awful Family in Britain," where they do this, where there's like a competition to see who can be the most like disgusting family in all of Britain. And obviously the Kolaskis are the most disgusting family. So in all of Clinton. So I liked that there's no nobility in poverty here. They're just they're just they're just absolutely uh, mercenary and not even kind to each other.
and
At
the
least,
interesting thing, a lot of it manifests itself in focusing on their drinking.
you know,
Mhm.
And you're like drinking out of jugs of wine and stuff, and you're thinking, well, here's a guy who's probably wasted right now, uh, writing about these low class, poverty stricken alcoholics and how horrible they are. And I thought, well, it's not a very charitable way to look at alcoholics if you're an alcoholic.
no, I think that's one thing that would be written differently about this book now. I think that the family that has no money would there maybe would be some sympathy for them, but in this book, Ed basically tells us that the prejudice that is leveled against them, the hatred, is totally justified because, like, you get the sense that Mary's dad would probably sell her if he could make money off of her, and so that's why I was saying that in comparison, Paul's family is there's at least a little bit of regard for one another, or at least a little bit of kindness and sympathy for each other. I had to appreciate some of those moments with Paul and some members of his family, because it's some of the rare places in this book where you get a little break from the otherwise nonstop cynicism, nonstop abuse. And I know that the weekend at the cabin, isn't it supposed to be a cabin that they take Paul to somewhere out in the middle of nowhere or something? Obviously it's all set up, and obviously things end up very badly for him. But I think he does have at least a few minutes of pleasant conversation with some of the guys.
What's interesting about that is that when we talk about Paul doesn't have any agency and that kind of stuff, which is true, but it's, I think, because he is dressed as a woman and goes in there with like his female persona, that he starts having these like flirtatious conversations with guys where he's kind of, even though he's ultimately the victim in this scenario, it's one of the only times where it seems like he's kind of, you know, in control of things in a way, at least in control of the way he's presenting himself to people. And I think it's interesting that it's because he's wearing women's clothing, you know?
Yeah.
One of the sentences, this is sort of a bit of a tangent maybe. One of the sentences that struck me that was really open for interpretation was, at one point Paul is thinking to himself, and the thought he has is that his father had, quote, served his sex apprenticeship in the Navy, unquote.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's another one of those two-worders, sex apprenticeship. That's one of Ed's.
So like what does that mean? We could interpret that a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
He mentions it actually a couple of times, Navy. Sorry,
Sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that sentence comes in an interesting section where Paul is ruminating on the church's effect on sex education in schools in small towns, where kids don't learn anything about sex because the church is so conservative and the church has influence over the schools and over the whole town. And so that people like Paul don't know anything about like the kind of stuff that quote unquote deviations versus regular sex. And he interestingly says he feels like his parents would be equally upset about a deviation as they would be over not like talking about it. They would be equally upset of him talking about being gay as they would be about having a rational discussion about sex in general. And I thought that was interesting. And in that same section, he does say keep the homosexuality behind closed doors, which you said that phrase earlier, Joe, behind locked doors, which they say in Glen or Glenda at least once.
Yeah.
And he refers to it as a scourge to which you are afflicted.
Church and school, that's good, right? I mean, two institutions that sort of pretend like this.
Well,
we'll get into a political conversation about today's world if we let ourselves, you know.
That's actually what I was going to say. That's like the one part when I read like that one couple sentences or paragraph, I thought, man, this is applicable to what's happening right now in places, especially with it being wrapped up in gender identity and drag and stuff like that. But it's just a brief moment in the book.
There we go. To make a homo was decades, if not many decades ahead of its time. Right?
Or times just don't change.
Right. I want to touch back on the Kolaski family. So yeah, they drink cheap wine, by the jug, right? They're really portrayed very negative in a very negative light. Mary, on the other hand, somehow is almost like portrayed as somebody who, although that's her family, that's where she came from, she somehow managed to, by the mere age of 15, separate herself from that. Her dialogue, by the way, if you didn't know it, be convinced that she was a fairly worldly type of intellect,
Yeah.
right? She's sharp. Mary Kolaski's quite sharp throughout the whole entire book. She's actually one of my favorite characters in the book. She's having fun with it. She knows exactly what's happening to her from the standpoint of her victimhood, but at the same time, how much control she can take, agency. I think we've seen that very clearly as a real thematic throughout the whole entire book vis-a-vis various characters. But Mary and Paul end up having, in some strange way, a pretty tight relation, not only sexual,
Yeah.
Well,
but
it's kind of like a
beyond that, a
Stockholm,
tight relationship. Yeah.
kind of like a Stockholm. I thought about this when Paul
Yeah.
was saying he was in love with Tommy, a Stockholm syndrome type thing where they're both hostages of Tommy, and so therefore they have something intimate in common with
Yeah.
each other, and therefore they form this strange, really like the Manson girls or something. Who
Well, it's
knows?
it's it's like in Tony, you have that brief, close relationship between the straight woman Tony and I can't remember the character's name. Was it Sheila, who was the
Sheila. Yeah.
cross-dresser at Madame Rose's? Again, it's that same thing. You have this brief. In that book, it was very brief. In this book, it's a much more extended relationship that the two have. Um,
By the way, this just popped into my head. Another when I was talking earlier about the narrative seeming to kind of go off a cliff after the house party. One thing I was wondering is they never get into it. The first half is so wrapped up in uh, living with your parents and living with your family and dealing with your parents and hiding stuff in the house and stuff like that. Then once he kind of goes full bore into addiction and prostitution, there's his home life and his parents just disappear immediately. There's never anything. Did they try to look for him? I mean, they're in the same small town, presumably. Um, did he ever think about his parents? Did he ever just decide to go home? I mean, there's nothing at all about how he got out of the house. Where does he live now? Does he still live at home and has his secret life? Did they ever look for him? That kind of stuff.
that's one of those plot elements that's just sort of it gets lost along the way,
Yeah.
right?
I had to wonder. I didn't know where he was living by the end of the book. I think I don't think he's still at home at this point. And I don't think that it will be much of an issue because I don't see these characters as like surviving much past, I don't know, another year, maybe. I don't know. I assume like our main trio of characters will probably be dead within a year. I think. Um, Although there is, I think, one hopeful mention of taking the cure. I think there is at one point
Right.
somebody talks about taking the cure, but it put me in mind of another Ed book that someday, well, I think I've already reviewed it, but it was called Purple Thighs, which is about the LSD and hippie world. And I think that one, if I remember correctly, that also ends with a character being addicted to heroin because they jab this character repeatedly with a needle to get this character addicted. So maybe that was, I don't know. That's another thing. I don't know if that's ever happened in real life to anybody. Anybody's ever actually done that to get people addicted. But that's how this novel ends. So I don't. Yeah, again, I don't see these characters as having any bright future ahead. I don't see like there's the cure is not at this point. I mean, is there any redeeming Paul or Tommy? I think is beyond redemption. I don't think any of these characters can be redeemed. So
I mean, it was, it was apparently a common ploy in the 30s by the mob to get hookers that worked
okay.
for them addicted to heroin so that they'd have to
Yeah.
keep turning tricks and get their heroin from the mob. So it was sort of a closed loop of control,
Thinking of the movie Taxi Driver, isn't like in that one, Harvey Keitel is a pimp and Jodie Foster is a prostitute, and I would have to guess that Jodie's character Iris is addicted to drugs in that one, and that's part of how Harvey Keitel holds control over her. So yeah, maybe it happens. I unfortunately haven't had the time in real life to delve into the real life world of drugs and prostitution.
Well, it's funny because I suspect like there's an element of truth, but also something that remains unspoken, which because it sounds pro drugs, which is that yes, there might be the intent to do that to do that to someone, to get them addicted for your own purposes, but that's kind of like you just introduce them to it. And then the thing is that like supposedly heroin is so awesome you would just want to keep doing it, you know? And so you don't have to do that much work once you get someone started. They would probably want to pursue their own, where do I get my heroin from, you know, just from having tried it. This is a little cynical maybe, but no one ever says like, well, it's easy to get people addicted because it's fun to do drugs, you know?
Well, I mean, crack was the same thing. You know, that it gave this such an incredible euphoric rush.
Okay, I had a question about the
huge downfall of, you know, for controlling yourself.
I had a question about the drug trade that arose from reading this book. Okay, if Tommy is the heroin distributor for the town, where's he getting his stuff?
Right. Good question. I mean, we would presume from some sort of larger network of dealers. You know, yeah, he's the ground level guy, right? There's a bigger machinery in place from the.
Did they mention that at all? Did they mention that he reports to somebody bigger or?
I don't Shame Ed didn't call it the organization. That
it could have been the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the business structure here, and in many other stories like this, I don't think makes much sense at all. I mean, it's kind of. Have you guys ever read "Go Ask Alice" or are aware of it?
That is exactly one of the books that was popping up through my mind through this entire book. So yes.
So it's interesting because it's two ends of the spectrum. I mean, this book is supposed to be an adult paperback that you buy specifically for like sex reasons. And then Go Ask Alice is supposed to be a book warning kids away from the dangers of doing drugs and how easy it is to do a gateway drug and then accidentally get addicted. And then before you know it, you're in a life of drugs and prostitution, and then you're dead. And that was presented as a real diary by a real person. And later it came out that the women who wrote it just made it all up. But and it's interesting that they're so similar and have such different reasons of being, you know what I mean? But they're both similar in the sense that you read it. Actually, Ed's book might be more realistic because reading Go Ask Alice, even when I was 15 years old or whenever I read it, every other sentence I would think no one would ever do this. This would never happen. This isn't how it works, you know? And I didn't know anything about the world, but it'd be like, you know, your old drug friends getting retaliation on you by finding out where you're babysitting and sneaking drug-laced cookies onto the counter so that you accidentally eat one and then get re-addicted to drugs, you know, things that no one's ever done before. But anyway, yes, the two books reminded me of each other quite a bit.
Yes, I thought, am I crazy here? Does this book have kind of a Go Ask Alice? This is sort of a mirror to Go Ask Alice. And I thought, oh, no one will mention that. So I will not mention it. So I'm glad that you did. If you have time in your life sometime, the comedian Paul F. Tompkins has a whole routine about Go Ask Alice called Freak Wharf. And so I would say, go on YouTube, search for Freak Wharf and look for Paul F. Tompkins talking about that book. And I have taught in schools where they just had piles and piles of paperback copies of Go Ask Alice because that was why that book got taught in schools so much, is because there were just a lot of cheap paperback copies of it. So it was very easy for schools to get copies of it. That's something that I learned in recent years, is that the books that we read in school so much, one of the reasons why certain novels get taught in high schools is just because of the availability of a lot of mass market paperbacks. of them. It's not necessarily that they were the greatest novels of all time. It's just that there were like cheaply available paperbacks. And not that the novels are bad or anything, but the reason why Animal Farm and To Kill a Mockingbird and things are like in every school is just because of the availability of these mass market paperbacks of them. And it's the same thing with it's the same thing with Go Ask Alice. And so I think if you went around to now, I don't think that novel is taught anymore. I don't think Go Ask Alice is taught.
I would think actually, I think To Kill a Mocking, the couple other books you mentioned, Joe, they're under fire in many places. Incredibly enough, with book banning all these years later, To Make a Homo, of course, won't get banned
to make a homo
really
should be taught in every American school. Every American.
To Kill a Mockingbird and Animal Farm are at least have literary value to them.
Right.
Go Ask Alice was like I was taught that in English class. And there's no redeeming literary value to that book. I could see if they taught it to us in like health class, even then it would still be BS. But if they taught it to us in like health class or like, I don't know, social studies or something, that's one thing. But the fact that I was in an honors English class in high school and Go Ask Alice was on the curriculum is ridiculous. But I mean, we read good books too. But
well, if you go around to American high schools, they probably have hundreds of copies of Go Ask Alice that they would be willing to unload very, very cheaply. Because
they're all on eBay right now. It looks like
so
glanced.
So, I think Ed, if he had found that book, would have been jealous because I think he would have said, "Oh, I could have written something like that for you in an hour or two." I could have written a Go Ask Alice myself. If that's the kind of stuff you want, sure. I'll have it. I'll have it on your desk by tomorrow morning.
And it seems to be almost from the same point of view, like someone who missed out on the hippie thing trying to write as if they understand the hippie thing. You know what I mean?
Well, I got to say, I got to give Ed credit for this book is that I don't know how carefully his books were edited or what was the process once he turned over a typed manuscript. But there were, I can't say that there were no typos in this. I think that there's like one or two places where like a word is substituted for another word, because they sound similar or are spelled similarly. But Ed wasn't making a lot of mistakes in this one. Normally, there are a lot of in some of Ed's stories where he's really incoherent. There's a lot of like goofs, and there's not even like weird. There's not a lot of ellipses and random capitalization. He keeps that all, and there's not. I don't remember any passages where like he forgets to make it into sentences and paragraphs and just rambles on for pages and pages. He doesn't do that. So. Yeah,
and at the same time, Joe, he hits on all of his major keywords and themes, so he's able to do it in a much more coherent manner. There's much mention, of course, of Angora and
Gloria has an Angora sweater,
all kinds of lingerie, etc., 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 and
silk and satin.
You mentioned that. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, there's something to be said for people writing about what interests them, because I thought all that stuff was the most interesting parts of the book. When Paul was getting into finding out that he likes to dress like a woman and all that, I thought all that was the most interesting and specific stuff. But then when it got into the more sensational stuff, it was less interesting to me. I think because Ed was probably less interested in it, and you could kind of tell in his writing. But I don't know.
Right.
Well, yeah, he got into his cross-dressing groove right there, and those very loving descriptions of the whole process and everything.
Well,
and what the person is thinking and feeling through it. And
I've often said that Ed's muses were booze, sex, death, and women's clothing. And I thought, he's getting in all of his muses here, and he even gets in the the Undertaker, because he says Paul wanted to sigh again, but he didn't. If everyone gave him the time of his life who thought they could, he might as well call up the Undertaker and make reservations. And I thought that is very typical of Ed's thinking. If he can steer it back to undertakers, morticians, graveyards, cemeteries, he would do that. So I was glad to see that. That's how you know, okay, we're on firm ground here. Ed's gotten his death references in, even in a context where it totally doesn't belong, but that's just how his mind worked, So, and we have to remember that there's a lot of Angora in this. There's a lot of mentions of Angora, but we also have to give some credit to, I think, silk or satin. I think, doesn't he say like he'd never had like a satin garment, or he'd never had one before on his skin or something? I don't know. So Ed, of course, loved Angora, but it was different kinds of fabrics and different kinds of textures.
There are quote unquote nylon jersey capri pants at one point, which is kind of cool. The capri pants are always nice to see, but nylon jersey capri pants is even better.
Does he describe Mary's outfits, by the way?
Mary's, yeah, he describes, I think, what Mary's wearing quite frequently.
In fact, there's a chapter where they make him dress up in Mary's clothes, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's when they go to they lure him down to the lake or the park or whatever, and initiate him into a three-way, basically. And it's interesting because since they lured him down there, he's in, men's clothing because he was just living his usual life. I don't know, walking around town.
The panties, yeah.
But he's got the women's underwear on, and again, I thought that was interesting. He tries to figure out how he can hide the fact that he's wearing women's underwear by like pulling his pants and underwear down at the same time and that kind of stuff. I find that those kinds of specifics interesting. Yeah, but what's also interesting is that the idea of being forced to dress in drag shows up more than once in Ed's stuff. It had me thinking of Love Feast, where the climax of the movie, where the character played by Ed Wood is forced to dress in drag. By a gang of women. And it's interesting because you've got this dichotomy of someone who likes to dress in drag, but also being forced to do it. So again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's like something you want to do, but it's even better if you have an excuse that's not your fault, and you're just giving in. And it makes me wonder if it was all just cross-dressing with Ed, or if he was a submissive of some kind, like he liked, like the submission turned him on as well, or if that's just made up for the book. And in that same sequence, someone says "Good Christ," which I can't remember which Ed Wood movie that's from, but
it's Fugitive Girls. It's in.
That's right.
Good Christ, a lesbian.
Yeah.
That's right.
Is there religion in this book at all? Does anybody?
Well, the church picnic.
Church picnic, yeah.
And church and school are institutions that are, anti well, whatever.
See, I just got through finally reading Jean Marie Stein's book, Ed Wood, The Early Years, which I don't think I would have discovered without this podcast where you interviewed Jean about that book. And the book alleges that Ed's parents were like regular churchgoers.
Sure.
So, by the way, that book is very worth checking out, by the way. I'm going to give that one a thumbs up. There are things I dispute in it, or things where I would say, well, it's just the author's interpretation of Ed's life and Ed's motivations. But I think if you're interested in Ed, the book is available very, very cheap online. So definitely try it. I only wish that when that book were written, that Jim, your book were out, The Secret War of Ed Wood, because to its credit, the book doesn't buy into Ed's war hero stories and doubts all the war hero stories. So, but then your book, I think, would have been a great resource for.
Interestingly enough, Joe, Jean Marie. I've known Jean Marie for a number of years now, and she actually got her hands on the war record back around 1995 or 6 or so, and she wrote an article in a magazine that she's sometimes edited for called Transgender Tapestry, and she wrote an article about the war record and debunking essentially the war record in much the manner that Jim did. What Jim did obviously was far beyond that, taking it with the copious annotations and really making a really cogent argument around it in a brilliant way. I sent a copy of Jim's book to Jean Marie a couple of years ago to have her check it out, and she was like, "Wow, this is unbelievable." But uh, and off topic, perhaps, but since you brought it up, there was one other person, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, who told me that they had sourced the war record as well. So it's interesting that people will go to these lengths to try to figure out more about Ed Wood. One thing I want to say, you mentioned quote unquote drug trade, Joe, and it jumped in my head where I thought drag trade. Remember the book Drag Trade? There's a sequence or a bit of narrative in Drag Trade where a young man, I don't remember if he knocks somebody up or whether he's just had sex with somebody. Now he's kind of leave town. It reminded me a little bit of Paul getting Mary pregnant, and it made me think it's a little bit similar in a way, and it made me wonder. Paul is in 10th grade. Ed was in 10th grade when he enlisted to go to war. So it kind of made me wonder biographically, are there a few things that maybe we don't know about?
Right. We've got the unintended pregnancy with the, shall we say, loose woman. We've got the, I don't know, is it in every book of Ed's, the syphilis worry?
Yeah.
Well, and also even the very first chapter at the church, or the first two chapters at the church picnic, I feel like every time I pick up something to read, not every time, but a lot of times when I pick up something to read by Ed, it involves a flashback or something about kids or teenagers being at some kind of function like that, where they go off by themselves, either in a barn or in the forest or in a cave sometimes, and experiment with each other, and sometimes involving, like in TV Lust, he puts on the girl's clothes that he's with and that kind of stuff. And so yeah, from like I mean, the most obvious way to look at it is like, is he just drawing from something that happened to him when he was a kid? But then of course, when you write fiction, you make stuff up, so who knows,
Well, if there's a character in this who is Ed's surrogate or Ed's stand-in, who do you think it is? Do you think it's, who would he identify with in this book? Do you think it's Paul? I guess it's probably Paul.
Right.
Although, who knows, maybe Paul and Tommy are the two halves of Ed Wood's personality. Maybe, he was sometimes more like a Paul and sometimes more like a Tommy, because there was obviously an angry, aggressive side to Ed's personality that could come out. And maybe that is, reflected in Tommy's behavior. Does Tommy have a last name, by the way?
Grimes.
Grimes, right. Oh, what a great Dickensian name, Grimes.
Yes. Yeah.
And Ed also, had the hustler in him, where, trying to maybe take advantage of people is the wrong way, but, salesmanship and that kind of stuff that you could kind of see in Tommy in a kind of evil way.
I can only hope that Ed's scene of Paul being swung like a pendulum between two men was purely fantasy based.
Do you think this book could have ever been made into a film? Do you think, and if so, I don't know what kind of movie that you would make out of this.
It would have been like the Dark Brothers, who did that like sort of punk edge porn in the 80s.
Like new wave hookers. And
yeah, like new wave hookers. Yeah.
Well, but you could go the other way too. Like, for instance, this could be, like you mentioned, Jailbait and Violent Years earlier. Like I could picture like a Violent Years version of this movie, or even Reefer Madness or whatever, where you got a bunch of high school kids played by, 25 to 30-year-old people where everything is just suggested and kind of takes place off screen.
Right.
And so you never know the explicit nature of what's happening, but it's still the story of a naive kid's downfall into drugs and sex without talking about, it would be interesting. Like, how could you turn this into a G-rated exploitation? Like, you know what I mean? I think
Do
it's doable.
like a Riverdale type,
Gosh,
like
I was
do a series like Riverdale, right? But with a lot more
No, I
cross-dressing
could.
and drug abuse.
Does Reefer Madness even have a rating? Like,
No. It's like from
it's
the
really,
30s.
it's
So.
30s. I know it's from the 30s, but I mean, sometimes, well, because sometimes even older films, when they're re-released into theaters, sometimes like retroactively, the MPAA will give it a rating.
I've
I
got a
don't know
copy
what
of it around here somewhere.
I, I don't know what Reefer Madness would get. Now, it wouldn't get a G. It would get like
A PG. It would
PG,
get a
PG,
PG.
Yeah, because
PG
just
13.
showing smoke
Or
these days.
well, now, yeah, you have characters actually smoking.
Yeah.
That would be a thing that would shock Ed. That is like, oh my God, you can get like rating, you can get a more restrictive rating just for smoking. So, yeah, now you can't now you can't do any. Well, but the other thing that you would have to do in describing the rating, um, sometimes you'll see like rated R for alcohol and drug use, all of it involving teens. Like that will be a phrase that is added to the rating. So that would be something to take into consideration. And it doesn't mean that the actors are teenagers. Because that I think at least as late into as the 1980s, that filmmakers would use as their excuse is that, well, these characters are supposed to be in high school, but the actors are obviously in their 20s, so you can do whatever.
The
Well, now
Breakfast
that's
Club
not.
or something like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like even the John Hughes movies, well, the actors are obviously all in their 20s, so it's fine. Nowadays, that's not fine. What matters is, I mean, obviously you don't want the actors to be in their teens, but if the characters are supposed to be in their teens, that's something to take into consideration. So, although I guess the TV show that people were talking about so much online recently, Euphoria, I haven't even seen an episode of that, but apparently it's about high school kids taking drugs and having sex and living all kinds of wild lives. And of course, the actors are all in their 20s, but um, you know, I think that's something that Ed would probably want to keep tabs on. If he were around today, he would be watching Euphoria and trying to and do his own version of it. But that makes that show controversial. Not that the actors are in their teens, but the fact that their characters are supposed to be in their teens. That is, although it obviously hasn't kept Euphoria. I don't know where Euphoria even airs. If that's a streaming show, if that's
HBO.
HBO. So it obviously hasn't kept it off the air, but
Yeah.
they air it.
HBO has a lot more leeway than
So yeah,
Teenagers doing drugs, it's hard to fathom, right?
oh
It's
my
hard to
gosh.
imagine.
This would be
Teenagers
this
having
would be
sex. Yeah.
this would be this is a novel to keep away from grandma. You don't want grandma finding this one. Oh my gosh, I can imagine. We talk about dowagers. Imagine Margaret Dumont from the old Marx Brothers movies reading this, fainting dead away at just the very sight of this. One thing I was curious about, this came from Little Library Press, and you were talking about the branding of it. And I noticed it had like a green border on the cover, and all the other Little Library Press books. Do they all have that? Is that like common to that to all those books?
Yeah, that's the design sense, commonplace
So
to not only the Little Library Press books, but also the Liverpool Library Press books. Yeah.
so and the book costs $1.95, which is the same price that Seymour pays for Audrey 2 in A Little Shop of Horrors for $1.95. And I did the inflation on it. What year was this book? 70, 71?
71.
71.
Yeah.
I did the inflation on it. It's like 15 or 16 bucks. Not bad.
No, that was pricey back then. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
your regular paperbacks were like 50 to
95,
95 cents
right?
Okay.
at most for a fat one. Yeah.
So I'm always shocked by, the prices on some of the magazines in those days. I was like, what?
Well, you've got this controlled, horny market that desperately.
The Vice thing.
They weren't screwing around when they. So those magazines, some of those pendulum magazines, they were expensive, and especially if you add in the inflation, gosh, boy, that's an investment. And those loops, forget it. I mean, that's a goddamn investment. So if you buy one of those and then you set up your screen and you set up your projector, and oh my God, you had to thread the stupid thing to the freaking projector and make sure it doesn't snag or tear or anything. And then if you watch it and you don't find it sexy or something, like, well, there you go. You're out like a used car worth of money. So it's like, I thought $1.95. No pictures in it. There's no photographs, I don't think, in this edition. We don't know, but probably not.
To quote Ed in this very book, I don't think this book sent many people into seclusion with the palm of their hand.
But there is an illustration on the cover, and it looks sort of, I don't know who did it, but it's sort of Phil Cambridge-y looking artwork on the cover.
They're pretty much all had that same vibe.
That same. Well, in the magazine articles, Bob Blackburn, God bless him, he would send me like the illustrations that came with the magazine articles, and sometimes you'd get these things that look sort of like courtroom illustrations of people, that style of artwork where it's realistic. But sometimes people would go like really abstract with the articles, with the magazine article illustrations. They would get really abstract with it, and sometimes kind of experimental. But for this, you wanted something. I think the cover shows two guys, right? I think it shows like a guy kneeling on a bed and a guy standing next to him or something. So, the thing is, I don't know if we've talked about this in this podcast, and you can use this novel as your gauge of what is Ed Wood's own sexuality? What is his personal sexual preference?
Right.
And I used to say that, Ed was heterosexual, but he would write gay stuff for pay. Basically, it was sort of literarily, and as a filmmaker and a writer, he was sort of gay for pay. But as I've seen like the intensity of the gay stuff that he wrote, the passion of the gay stuff that he wrote, I have to wonder, was it just something he could turn on and off like a faucet when he was writing, like, oh, I'll get myself into writing gay sex mode, even though I'm not gay myself? Or do you think there was, do you think he was at least bi? Do you think?
In Jean Marie Stein's book, The Early Years, Joe, I don't know if you caught it, but she very, very, I want to say tendentiously, it's not clear, but she hints at not only Ed's war years being, myth made, but also his sexuality, the whole idea of him being a straight, quote unquote, straight cross-dresser. And honestly, Jean Marie Stein is somebody who transitioned over time as well. So I think, well, I don't want to put words in anybody else's mouth. I'll go back to your original notion. I've seen now, maybe I just found a month or so ago, 3 weeks ago or so, another dozen or 15 of the all male pendulum Calga mags, and I think I've got them all now, and there's got to be upwards of 40 or more of them, and Ed essentially writes them cover to cover. It's very clear, all the short stories, all the articles, as well as all the additional collateral text. So it's hard to fathom that he could have written to that great a volume just on the basis of gay for pay. And especially with the level of detail, there's so much detail here.
Yeah, right? That's what I was coming away with from this book, was that it is it's too specific, it's too passionate, I guess, or I guess, there's too much psychology in it for it just to be um, basically a costume Ed is wearing for the length of this one book. So
I think that was a convenient, that was a very convenient and understandable fiction for the time he was in, right?
right.
To the completely, yeah, I like to wear women's clothing, but other than that, yeah, I'm a red-blooded American boy who likes just girls, right?
Well, that's in
Yeah,
the Tim Burton film. That's how it's
right.
handled in the Tim Burton film. Um,
So I don't know the answer to this question, but I would say that from this book and other things I've read by him, whether he's gay or straight, it's clear that dressing like a woman trumps both of those things
yeah,
by
that's
far. And I think one of the most interesting chapters in the book is chapter 4, where he ruminates on cross dressing a lot, and he says there's a couple interesting things about it. And you mentioned someone transitioning earlier. Um, there's a section where he's talking about looking at himself as a woman and becoming turned on by himself as a woman, and viewing his own male parts as another male having sex with him as a woman.
yeah.
And I found that interesting because
Yeah.
a lot of times when I hear stuff by or about trans people, they will disassociate from the part of themselves that they don't view as their true self. So if I'm a woman and I have a penis, I don't like my penis. I'm not interested in my penis. I don't want to think about it or see it, or I've heard that kind of stuff before. I don't know if that's universal experience, but I found it interesting that in Ed's book, the guy, he was incorporating his male part into his female fantasy in a way that's not this necessarily the same way that we think of trans people now. And I'm not saying Paul was trans or Ed was trans either, but it gets into that, and then it gets into him feeling guilt and shame for cross dressing, and he looks at himself in the mirror as a man and says he can still see the image of himself as a woman superimposed on himself like
Yeah.
at the movies. And so he's thinking from a filmmaking point of view. And then he ends on saying, from Paul's point of view, if I become a woman and then I have sex with a man, then that means I'm not gay because I'm really a woman, or at least I look like a woman. Getting back to what you were saying about being a man dressed as a woman, getting together with another woman, he also
Yeah.
thinks about it from the point of view of, I'm not really gay as long as I'm a woman, you know? And I found that interesting. And it made me wonder if that's part of Ed's rationalization about not really being gay, or whatever the case may be. Of course, we can never know this for sure, but
No, it's just we can just try and speculate from the work that exists. So um, I would say that Ed's sexuality is complicated, Byzantine, labyrinthine. There's a lot going on there. There's, as you say, rationalization, and but that's one of the strangest things is that if a man in Ed Wood's books and stories, if a man in drag has sex with a woman, like that's somehow satisfying to that's enough for a woman, that's enough to satisfy a lesbian, as long as the man looks like a woman, it's okay, I guess. And then Madame Elise even says, oh, the sight of a naked male disturbs me, but the sight of a naked female puts me in heaven, or something like that.
yeah.
I'm
And even in that house party where he's passed around to all kinds of different guys, he keeps saying, like, it's going to be better if I keep my clothes on, it'll be better.
Yeah.
If I'm dressed as a woman, it'll be better. And they keep on being like, take your clothes off, take your clothes off. And to him, it's like an essential part of the sexual experience to be dressed as a woman. Once he takes the clothes off, he's not a woman anymore, and so it's not sexy. You know what I mean? From his point of view.
Yeah.
Or it's now gay sex, not straight
Well,
sex.
yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's complicated. I thought that, like, with that idea of never being naked, is never being totally naked. I didn't know that was a thing. There's a TV show called Arrested Development, where David Cross's character was a never nude, and I thought that was something I was kind of made up for this TV show, but it's turned up in multiple Ed Wood works. this idea. So I thought, oh, okay, I don't know, maybe it's a real thing for some people. And the world is a huge place with lots of people in it, and every single one of those people has their own little internal uh, map of what is sexy and not sexy. And so um, I would say if a fetish is possible, or if a sexual predilection is possible, somebody has it. You know, there's somebody. You know, right behind me is a ceiling fan. Is there people who are sexually attracted to ceiling fans? Yes, there is. Somewhere in this world, there is somebody going to, Home Depot and going to the ceiling fan department with an erection. Somebody is like that. That fetish. It's not many people. It wouldn't be enough to be like even 4 or 5 people. Not even enough for a support group. But it's impossible that the number is 0. Because if it is out there in the world, somebody is into it. And probably there's erotic ceiling fan fiction being written somewhere in the world where
there should be, if there's not. Right?
I'm already thinking like you tie like a cord from one end of the ceiling fan.
It's a confession
down to your genitals, and then as it goes around, it manipulates your genitals as it goes around.
Sure.
And so I was thinking,
okay.
like, and again, it's maybe 2 people in the world, maybe 3 people in the world, and God bless the internet, because now, whatever your thing is, your best chance of finding somebody is the internet. I remember a story of John Waters going to Hellfire, the sex club in New York, I guess it was, and there was one guy he saw that night who's spent the entire night on the floor, licking the floor. And John's reaction to it was, thank God I don't have that one. Yeah. That was his reaction to that guy. And not that he was judging the guy for doing what he was doing, because it's just, oh, thank God I don't have that one. Because I'm sure that guy didn't probably choose that as his path. That just, that's just the way it ended up for him. So
as they say in Glen or Glenda, there but for the grace of God go I. Right.
Right.
So do you think that this would you recommend this book to Ed Wood fans in general, or would you say is this a book that only serious Ed Wood fans should check out, or do you think this has an appeal, a broader appeal?
I think you need to be an Ed Wood fan to derive any sort of
enjoyment out of it.
Enjoyment out of this whatsoever. Anybody beyond outside of that scope would probably, even if you were reading it from the standpoint of, I want to read a book about cross-dressing, or I want to read a book about the challenges of deciding whether I am or am I not homosexual, whatever the case may be, you wouldn't derive a whole heck of a lot.
And it fails pretty
right.
And it fails pretty conclusively as porn, as we've all talked about.
That being said, for an Ed Wood fan, though, to answer your question, though, it's enormously entertaining, right? If you're a serious Ed Wood aficionado, I would say it's enormously entertaining.
Yeah, I would say it depends on the Ed Wood fan, though, because I would say don't bother if you're the Ed Wood fan who is only into Ed Wood in the sense of Plan 9 is the worst movie ever made, and Mystery Science Theater 3000 and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in Ed Wood as a person, then I think it's very interesting because of all the chapters about cross-dressing and stuff.
That's actually something, Paul, you make a great point. Yeah. It's something that's hard for some people to reconcile. I think we all have talked to some people in the Ed Wooddom who were kind of like, who don't want to have anything to do with a book like this, who do prefer to preserve in their mind the vision of Ed Wood, the goofy director who made, the low budget Plan 9 from outer space. Right.
They want him to have died right at the end of the Ed Wood movie.
Right. Yeah. And did you know that the the flying saucers were made of hubcaps or something?
Yeah.
Right.
That's all they wanted to.
And it can be sad. I mean, I remember when I was first getting into Ed Wood and I watched like look back in Angora, and it would get to the sequence using lots of clips from Love Feast and talking about,
Right.
the 60s and 70s. Like it would get kind of sad because you do, like, when you first get into Ed Wood, you kind of, or for me, admire kind of, especially if it's through the Tim Burton movie, admire like the go get 'em attitude and the doing things against all odds and eternal optimism and not caring what people think about you and all that kind of stuff. And then to see how he ends up, it's sad. I mean, I guess it would be sad no matter the context, but at the same time, you can apply all that stuff to his later. I mean, all the books he wrote, all the stories he wrote, it all comes from kind of the same place as the popular Ed Wood stuff. But yeah, I mean, it can get depressing to think about. But
I hope that when Ed completed this manuscript, he thought he had a hit on his hands. He was like, Bernie, have I got one for you, man? This is going to be a hit. He was proud of his books. He would, as reflected by the fact that he engraved so many with his signature and sometimes personal. I've said in past episodes of this podcast I wouldn't want that I get nervous around having like the old paperbacks, literally the old paperbacks, because you have to keep them in plastic or you have to keep them, but someday maybe I will like to have at least one of the books that he signed, like the inside cover, and he wrote a message to somebody. So yeah, I guess I would like that, as long as I also have like an ebook, as long as I just have an ebook that I can just read. Probably the vintage paperbacks, you can't really take them around with you and read them because they're gonna fall apart. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would, but I would someday like to have a copy of any of the books that maybe just has his signature in them. I hope that he thought, like, I think he liked his own writing. I think he was, a fan of himself. So yeah, I hope that he had high hopes for this one. How long do you think it took him to write this? I think maybe a day or two or something like that.
I think a couple days.
I
was wondering if the first half of the book was day one and the second half of the book was day two.
So, yeah. Yeah. At least during those 2 days, I'm sure he downed a lot of Imperial and downed a lot of canned spaghetti, as we've talked about. Yeah. Do people eat in this book? Is there any? Well, there's a church picnic, but do we ever actually have people eating anything?
Oh, his mom makes him a sandwich. She makes him
his mom makes him a sandwich. Oh, salami. Okay, salami it's going on the list of Ed Wood motifs because he, of course, wrote Operation Salami, or an invasion of the gigantic salami, and so yeah, salami must have been that's another.
And Ed did regale us with one of his favorite things, the synonym list. So you have the bone queen.
Oh,
the
yeah,
big
right.
Dick
All
queen, the cornhole queen, the crushed fruit queen.
Yes.
The dinge queen,
dinge queen. Okay, dinge queen is a term that was familiar to me because of another John Waters movie, Mondo Trasho. The end scene of it, which I have transcribed on my blog somewhere, you can find it, is these two characters, these two old ladies are watching Mary Vivian Pierce, and they're speculating, oh, what is this? Some kind of dinge queen, a wash rag queen, a speed freak? Is it a hippie, a flower child? And they're using, some of the terms are very familiar to me, and then some of the terms are totally unknown to me. So I think, size queen is one that's still used, but dinge queen, I didn't know what that was, so I had to find. And
we get meat whistle on literally
meat whistle.
Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing that kills the eroticism in Ed Wood's books, is because he will use the dumbest terms in the sex scenes. Like, he took out his throbbing ding dong, and I was like, oh my God.
I made a list because I was wondering what all he would use. And some of them are are like common, like wang and tool. But then he gets into meat whistle, which you said, and he says sausage a bunch of times. He's
Yeah.
got muscle, and then he's got sex muscle, in case you were confused. He's got rod, and he's got Hubert, the worst character in the book, in my opinion, says jolly stick, which is almost joystick, which presages the
the joystick
invention of video games. Or
That's funny you
goes right
say that,
along.
Paul, because I've seen the term joystick actually used in this context prior to actual joysticks in video gaming. So
well, there you go.
yeah.
And he did have one usage of joy jollies for orgasm that I can recall. So,
but yeah, sometimes it brings it down to the level of what a kid just learning about sex would say. So, you know, the one thing that I guess I was grateful for in this book is that sometimes especially in his gay sex stories, like he'll introduce like a disgusting element like flatulence or something like in the middle of a sex scene. I'm like, oh God, Ed, why are you doing this right now?
Well, that's in this too.
Oh, is it?
There's the one scene where up in the cabin in the mountains, when Paul has an encounter with another cross-dresser named Shelley. After Shelley performs oral sex on him, Paul relaxes by breaking wind.
So, and he, quote unquote, almost as soon as Shelley had released his love muscle, so there's another love muscle, Paul found the hurt disappear as if it had drained out in the fart he made loudly into the soft bed.
Yeah.
Very poetic. Yeah.
God, Ed. Oh, man. But there's sometimes there's books where like whole books where he'll just kind of dwell on the gross scatological aspects of the story. And I don't know why Ed was like that. I would have to assume that given his diet of, I guess, you know, cheap alcohol and canned spaghetti, that he was having some, you know, gastrointestinal problems frequently. You look at Ed and in the 1970s, he's not a healthy looking guy. He is, oh gosh, I can only imagine. Did the place at Yucca Flats, did it even have its own bathroom, or do you think he had to like go down the hall to the bathroom?
I think, well, I was going to say it must have had its own bathroom, but what were you going to say?
No, that maybe it was one of those places where you had to go down to go down the hall and stuff like that. But Yucca Flats is, by the way, it's been cleaned up. It's nice looking now. I think it's like student dorms or something.
In fact, you can find videos online where students make videos about like, hey, I'm starting art school. Check out my dorm. You can like see the inside of it now. And it's interesting.
It's been sort of gentrified. That's why I would say watch the documentary On the Trail of Ed Wood, I think hosted by Conrad Brooks or something, because you kind of get to see Yucca Flats in its last days as a hovel or, you know, and it is a really squalid looking, depressing place. So if you want to see what, maybe it's not as bad as it, I think On the Trail was made, I don't know, in the 80s sometime or something. But if you want to see what the place looked like when Ed lived there, watch that movie. It's so funny to think that place is now being cleaned up. I think, did Bob Blackburn actually live in that building?
No, he lived right behind it.
Behind it. He lived around the corner from it.
So he lived in the same building as Kathy, and I guess Kathy moved into a building shortly after Ed's death, moved into a building behind the Yucca Street apartments.
So I have not made the pilgrimage out there. Unfortunately, I don't have the time or money to travel or anything like that. But yeah, I don't know if I would. It doesn't really look the same as it did. But if you really, that's why I cherish that footage from. I think Connie Brooks goes out there himself.
Yeah,
and and it looks like the screens are falling off the windows, and there's
Mhm.
like graffiti on the place and stuff. So um,
Have
I
you been
think,
out in Greg's haunting grounds, Greg?
have you?
Ed's haunting grounds. If Greg, have you ever been out there?
Not out on the West Coast. No, I've been to
Yeah.
Poughkeepsie though. I was to
Okay. Yeah.
Poughkeepsie
Yeah.
I
earlier this year. Yeah.
I I have been to the Yucca Street apartments. I didn't know Bob at the time, so I didn't know to. Apparently, he will like walk you around and show you stuff if you
Yeah,
contact
yeah,
him. But I didn't know about him at the time. But I was in Hollywood for another reason and made sure was staying very close to the apartments, so I made sure to walk down there. And it's interesting because everyone has different points of view, or different life experience, Um, uh, so different people will tell you different things. I have seen things online from people who have gone there fairly recently who, even if the building has been cleaned up, still claim they were afraid for their lives just being on the street.
okay,
But I walked down there. It didn't scare me. There was maybe one point on my journey where the road narrowed a little bit and it was kind of a little bit isolated. And I thought, if anything happened to me, it's going to happen here, but nothing happened. And I looked at the outside of the building. I walked down to Playboy Liquor. Playboy Liquor probably looks exactly the same inside and out as it did
right.
back then. Back then, the 7-Eleven was still there. I think it burnt down recently.
Oh, okay. The
Um,
the infamous 7-Eleven. Yeah,
yep,
that was.
still there. And I saw a couple other Ed Wood sites while I was down there, but
Yeah, the
it was
Playboy.
definitely it was worth doing, but it's not the hellhole that people say it is or was.
It's interesting, Paul. When I was in Poughkeepsie back in February, I went to the Franklin Street address as well as a number of other addresses, houses where he grew up, and the other houses are all still standing. The Franklin Street house,
Yeah,
which in the sort of Ed Wood lore was the place he grew up in and lived in his entire uh, existence in Poughkeepsie before he went to war. Not the case, as a matter of fact. He just lived there for a short snippet of time. Nonetheless, I went there, and it's a vacant lot now, as I think we've all seen pictures
yeah,
of. But there's a very large apartment building right next to it, and so I won't get into the details to you know. Uh, keep it under wraps as to what was going on there, but there were some other folks with me. And when we got there, we started, getting out of our cars and we're there looking at the vacant lot and stuff like that. In the apartment building, there's a very loud argument going on where a gentleman was cursing his head off in a very violent way. I'll fucking kill you kind of shit, right? Screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, I grew up in a town. Well, actually, I didn't. I grew up in a little rural area by a lake, but I eventually moved to a town where I now live, which is very much like a town like Poughkeepsie, one of these old sort of post-industrial wastelands, right? After the industrial era, after the coal mining and after the uh, different industries went south, these places became, socioeconomically very, very deprived. And it was very clear that this area of Franklin Street was exactly that for the most part. There were a couple nice houses across the street. There were a lot of really, really big houses that were obviously built probably in the late 19th, early 20th century. Really, really big houses of a sort that you wouldn't even see built today because they would cost so much money to build. Certainly not in these kind of residential areas. But nonetheless, the folks that were with me, because we were there and we were going to take some pictures and do a few other things. They were like, let's leave and we'll come back later. This sounds like something bad is going to happen. And we, in fact, left. Right. And I was just thinking to myself, whatever. When we came back later, somebody actually came out of the apartment building and was chatting with us. And I'm thinking, this is just what it's like in an area like this. But if you're not from a place
Right.
like that, if you're not
right.
from a place like Yucca Flats, you don't know what it's like in the day-to-day existence. Would seem to an outsider fairly dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that the stories of Yucca Flats in the 70s probably were true. I mean, because they had
Oh yeah,
multiple, yeah, they had multiple people in Nightmare of Ecstasy who say, like, um, oh
yeah.
yeah, I was afraid for my life when I went over there. And I don't know why, but the image that sticks in my mind is just that there would be like dog crap in the hallways that you would have to get
Yeah,
to
that's what
get
they
to.
said. Yeah.
So, but I'm sure that's where he was living when he wrote this.
Yeah.
When he wrote this book. So, um, that was a frenzied couple of afternoons.
And I guess, from my understanding, I think they lived there long enough that they saw it go turn shitty. When they got there, it was
Okay.
bad, but not that bad. And then it got a lot worse, apparently. And Kathy says it's because once the 7-Eleven opened, everything went downhill. um, there were already colorful characters and it was already a cheap apartment and stuff, but there was apparently a point where stuff went downhill and it got a lot worse.
Yeah, it was actually a fairly notorious area during that time frame, and thereafter. I think even in the few years after Ed's death, it was even more notoriously violent and crime-ridden.
And from the look of it in the Conrad Brooks documentary, it was still like what you
Yeah.
said, Joe.
Yeah,
It looked
still
like it was
pretty
still
bad.
really rough.
Which
Yeah, it
is
was.
a story for another day, perhaps. But of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
decade prior, he had a place with a pool in the back, an in-ground pool in the
Right.
backyard. So his socioeconomic reality had obviously changed very quickly
See,
and
so
dramatically.
Ed's life is also a Horatio Alger story in reverse.
Yeah.
He's, uh, so that's why I was sort of joking about that at the beginning, but this is sort of the American boy, local boy makes bad, I guess is what this is what to make a homo is about. That term, I don't think we've talked about the terminology, but I don't think that term is used much or at all in the book. I don't think people say like, oh, you're a homo or
Not
something.
at all. Not at all. That was very commonplace. I was born in 1968, so by the time I was probably in, late elementary school, junior high school, or something like that, that was what you would call
Well,
somebody if you were having an argument or you fucking homo, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I
Not
just,
apropos of nothing, just because it was a way to slam somebody. Yeah.
well, just by pure coincidence, I saw a Saturday Night Live sketch from 1982. Now, if you go back to the 80s Saturday Night Live, obviously the thing that people will say over and over again is, well, there's a joke you wouldn't do today. There's a joke you wouldn't do today. There's a joke you wouldn't do today. And I don't know if people remember the Dr. Pepper advertising campaign. I'm a pepper, you're a pepper.
David Naughton.
With David Naughton.
Yeah, sure.
And they did their version. I'm a homo, you're a homo, he's a homo, she's a homo. Wouldn't you like to
Oh,
be a homo too? Be a homo, act
I
like a
do
homo.
remember it now that you say it.
And um, the way I found this clip, though, was in a compilation of SNL clips that had been that were like LGBT friendly. Like they took this because if you watch the commercial, it's actually very positive. Come on out, America! America's turning gay. It's the proudest moment since Independence Day. And it's like the doctor and the fireman and the old lady and everybody's turning gay. And then that ends up in I'm a homo, you're a homo, he's a homo, she's a homo. And so in retrospect, it can look like Saturday Night Live is showing that people are coming out of the closet and being proud. But I know myself and what I was like in 1982. And I know what kids were like on the elementary school playground in 1982. I know for a fact how we would have reacted to that sketch. We would have thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And had I seen it, people on the playground like the next Monday would have been, I'm a homo, you're a homo, she's a homo, be a homo, act like a homo, would have been used like to taunt people, I'm sure. Just thinking about that term, homo, they've revived Beavis and Butthead a few times, and there's of course now a new one at Paramount. And there are aspects to Beavis and Butthead that they don't do anymore. And like one is using like anti-gay slurs to insult each other, which is something that real teenage boys would do. And one of the running jokes on Beavis and Butthead was involving the word homo. And the pun on the word homeowner. So whenever anyone would say the word homeowner,
Yeah.
that would like crack them up. And there was a guy who came on television and said, "Attention, homeowners," and then, but it says, "Pay attention, Beavis." So homo is, I think in the 80s, I just remember it, being an insult term, So
Right.
um, that's the only thing that where I'm going to be worried when I put this thing on my blog. Oh God, are they going to flag this for something?
Well,
Because
homeowner in that sense was even running around in the 70s when I was a kid.
the homeowner joke goes back to the 70s.
Yeah, which now I can date myself as the old
Well,
fart on this
No, no,
call.
it's
well, that makes sense because Mike Judge, the creator of Beavis and Butthead, would have been going around in the 70s hearing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
so yeah, homeowner. That was
And
something.
all sorts of gay slurs were just in common usage
Sure.
in the 70s,
Well,
Um,
homo is maybe on the gentler side of it because people have pointed out like the first Wayne's World sketch on like one of the first Wayne's World sketches on Saturday Night Live, or maybe the first one. Uh, there's an adult authority figure played by Phil Hartman that they don't like called Beav, Beav, and because he's got like big buck teeth. And they do a top 10 list, top 10 things that Beav says. And one of them was, "Hi, I'm Beav. I'm a big fag," you know, and like that got a huge laugh at the time. And they don't literally mean that Beav is homosexual. They're just using it as just a general pejorative, So
Interesting. Fag is only mentioned, I think, once or twice in the whole entire book here, and to make a homo, right? I think we get one
yeah,
mention of the word fag.
fag.
Yeah.
But so
I
I
mean,
don't know.
I mean, I was going to say, in the 70s, I mean, it was a general insult that was often, that would be used regardless of context.
I'm trying to remember if Animal House uses the term homo as a pejorative. Feels like something that would be in there. I can't say for sure, but yeah, I know how that. But I very much remember elementary school and junior high school, and I remember how that term was used. So it was not. God bless the people who have taken it back, who have reclaimed the term. Um, I don't know that all of the pejoratives and slurs have been reclaimed, but maybe there's an effort underway to reclaim homo as the term. But
If not, we can start one, right?
right,
Right. Right. Starting with this review of Ed Wood's To Make a Homo.
we're taking it back.
We're taking it back. We're taking it
Taking
back.
it back. We're taking back. We're taking back
I think
homo.
I think we've gone into great depth about this
Yeah.
particular book here, and this may very well be close to clocking in at the very lengthiest Ed Wood Summit podcast yet. I think we might be
So I've been on the shortest one and the longest one, I
the
think.
shortest and the longest. Yeah. So we won't even make a joke about that, Paul. So again, I appreciate the fact that you guys all are here with me to share so many insights. I hope for the audience at home, you guys recognize, of course, we're dealing with a text from 1971, and we are trying to deal with it in as sensitive a manner as we can without eliding, the truth of the matter. And
Right.
it is quite graphic, and it is offensive, certainly by today's standards. There's no doubt about it, and we totally recognize all that. So we hope you've enjoyed, obviously, what we've had to say. I do want to go around one last time, real quick, to make sure that there's nothing else that you guys didn't want to touch upon. Paul, anything else?
Well, like I said, I took a bunch of notes. I think we covered almost everything. The only thing I did not mention was that it did cross my mind to wonder in some of the heroin parts with needles, and there's a part where he's talking about track marks, but I don't think he calls it track marks, but he describes what they look
Right,
like.
right.
It did cause me to wonder if maybe thinking about Bela Lugosi or his experiences with Bela
Oh,
Lugosi during these times. But a guy like Ed, I mean, who knows? Maybe he was around all kinds of, heroin users. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it probably was around people who did use. He was definitely around people who did use intravenous drugs. So yeah, he would have maybe some firsthand knowledge, or at least like
yeah.
adjacent to firsthand knowledge to it.
No, that's good. I mean, I actually hadn't thought Bela Lugosi in that context. But yeah, he literally describes, cooking it up on the spoon, and he describes it in fairly vivid detail. So he's certainly seen people perform this activity up close and personal, sadly. So
One other little detail, since we previously discussed Frank Leahy and football and all that kind of stuff, there was one reference to football in this book, and it was to Paul's dad watching football on
Oh,
TV.
yeah,
I
yeah.
found it interesting because he said Paul's dad was watching a repeat of a football game.
Right. I wondered about that. How could you do that back in the 70s?
Yeah, I was going to ask, was that a popular thing to not show live football games, to show a repeat of a previous broadcast in case you missed it?
it's good.
Might have been.
70s, I'm not sure. I know in the early 70s, like Knick games were not broadcast live. So you had to watch them at a later time, usually an off hour. The early years of the NBA being on TV, but I don't know about pro football back then.
Maybe in that sense, they at a certain point considered all of them repeats because they were not, you know what I mean? It was a repeat of a live event.
Strictly live, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Interesting. It didn't strike me as I read it.
Back when we had 3 or 4 or 5 channels, depending where you.
Well, no, that is something that stood out as like a false note along the way. You hear, or a clunker. You hear like, what? Was there ESPN Classic back in those days or something? Like, what's going on?
Four channels. I had 4 channels: ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS.
And PBS. And if you were lucky, there was a couple of independent channels.
Yeah.
We would get a couple from Detroit, and I was glad we did, because they would show movies, and that was where I saw a lot of movies for the first time, was on those independent stations from Detroit, and they eventually got swallowed up by CW and Fox and whatever the hell. So
I think a lot of my movie show actually made it to me via Bowling for Dollars from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. after I would get home from school every day. Bowling for this week, Planet of the Apes week. This week, Darren McGavin films or something totally, bizarre.
So that was the way to. I will say, in my way of summing up, is that if you have a book club out there in the world, you're getting together, the suburban housewives or whatever, getting together to do book club once a week, and maybe you're getting a little bored with it. It's getting a little stale, a little musty. What you're going to do? Track down enough copies for everyone of To Make a Homo, and have that be the next book. And forget the Jane Austen book club or whatever. Have the Ed Wood book club. Read To Make a Homo, and somebody's got to put on To Make a Homo the musical. That's I think the next. You could have just like a big dancing heroin needles, people. I just like that idea of a heroin needle having like arms and legs and a face sticking out of it, and so I think the commercial possibilities for this book are endless.
Indeed. Thanks, Joe. We could do a big musical number right at the church picnic, right out of the gate, right? Big number to open things, right?
So that big opening number right after Paul vomits, he clears his face off and turns and launches into this beautiful song.
Like a Disney moment, the camera sweeps up into the meadow, and we see it.
I'll that's my last thing to say.
Okay.
Yes, that's a good place to end it, certainly with vomit dripping down Paul's chin as the book starts, as a matter of fact.
Right. You want to start on a good note.
Again, this was a lot of fun. I use that term advisedly, perhaps, for some of you watching it. You may be thinking to yourselves, if you've actually slogged through it this far, you guys have lost your fucking minds. We are going to do it again, though. We will certainly be back in some form or combination. I'm sure I hope I can twist all of these gentlemen's arms to join me at some point in the future to talk more about Ed Wood here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I think, I'll hold my tongue, actually. There are some irons in the fire with some other Ed Wood books potentially turning up that folks have yet to see. And there's certainly plenty of others that we know about that we haven't yet talked about, and certainly no one on planet Earth in 45 years running has delved into these books to the degree that we have, and I'm proud of that, as a matter of fact. So I'm proud to host things here on the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Happy to always have these gentlemen with me, and happy to bring it back to you again in the near future. Again, as always, I hope you found this somewhat entertaining, perhaps. I hope you weren't overly offended. If you were, I understand why. And I hope you found it in some way even beneficial. So thanks for joining us here at the Edward Summit Podcast. Have a great one, everybody. Bye.
Bye.